Well, let me pause you with that one, because getting back to the gut health, a lot of people won't even register that that's a symptom for them. That morning, they may have, blown like it's coming out of a garden hose.
Right.
And then asked 4 hours later, how's your digestion? It's good.
Right.
So it's really think about that first. Like, what, just across the board, what are you taking for granted that could be abnormal, that is abnormal when you're doing it, like when you're, splattering the toilet in the morning 4 times before you leave the house.
Right. It's the, this is normal for me. I'm like, no, it's not normal for anyone.
Yeah.
So.
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. All right, guys, we're back with another episode of Table Talk. Today, my guest is Austin Stout. Austin is a physical, I made notes here, right? So a physical enhancement and health coach.
Okay.
I made the note of that because that's what's on your Instagram, but I like the way that sounds because it encompasses everything that you do.
Yeah.
And you've been doing this for over a decade, almost 15 years, right?
Yeah.
Hundreds of clients that you've worked with, also a competitive bodybuilder. Last show was a couple of years ago. So before we get into some topics, I want to kind of do a deep dive into some of these things. Let's just recap how you got into all this. So wrestling in high school is where we'll jump off. So I don't need to hear about your childhood.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. So as bad or good as it was, we don't need to know that. All right. So you're wrestling and then you find training. At what point in your wrestling career did the training's always involved.
Yep.
At what point throughout your process did the training start to become as important or more important than the sport?
I think with it being a weight restricted sport, it's like there's a lot of deleterious habits with weight cutting and all that stuff. And performance suffers, especially when you have like same day weigh-ins and things like that. So I wrestled 145 pounds in high school, my senior year. Funny story, I actually wrestled a heavier weight class the year before, because then when I got into nutrition and training a little bit more, I was actually able to drop down a class and perform better, be less tired, leaner, so on and so forth. But what I was finding was everything nutritionally I would try to pull up was all bodybuilders. So I'm like, all right, well, these guys know something, because that's the only thing I kept searching. And I ran across like everything. I was like bodybuilding media, whether it was back then, it was no IG. So it was, or Facebook, barely.
Yeah. And a lot of the sport nutrition things you would find was not what you would be looking for.
Correct. And so it was like muscular development, RX muscle forums, professional muscle, to, kind of got into that realm.
So right on the back end of that.
Right. And so beyond that point, I actually started training like a bodybuilder for wrestling, which in hindsight probably wasn't the most optimal thing. But of course I got way stronger, and the muscle, that fast twitch muscle, still translated in wrestling. And so I had a little bit of a scholarship offer for wrestling. I didn't really like the school. I wasn't D1 level. So I decided to go to a local school, and I'm like, I'm going to keep doing this bodybuilding thing. So I actually started prepping for my first show. I was still in high school. So I'm bringing all my Tupperware to school, sitting at the lunch table, that weirdo, with all my weighed out shit. Everyone's getting Uncrustables from the lunch line and shit. And, so I did my first show in August of that year. So I graduated in probably, June, May, somewhere in there. Did the first show in August in the teenage division. I prepped myself out of a Beverly International magazine.
Okay.
So I followed the diet and I adjusted it for my, my weight. And I kind of was like, okay, when I stall, I eat less. I take the shit away. I was doing like the prescribed refeeds and things that they had in there. And I did fine, didn't know what I was doing, but I did okay. And then the next show I competed the following year, and I got linked up with a coach. He helped me for a couple years there, mostly in preps. And I finally, 2011, I got into like real bodybuilding shape. Like striated glutes, like the whole.
How'd you do in that first show?
I think I got second place out of 5 people in the teen division, which whatever, you know, it's fine.
Yeah.
You know?
I did kind of the same thing. It was the summer after my high schools when I did my first bodybuilding show, and it was kind of the same process.
Right.
Just eat less, train, and
I
placed about the same. You know, so nothing to dial home about. No,
I mean, you figure but up to that point, before my senior year of high school, I'd never seen my abs before. Like, I was not ripped.
Yeah. Even at 145 wrestling.
I mean, I did by that time when I got lean.
Okay.
But, prior to that, I was basically just a stocky, chubby kid. I wrestled 145. I competed at like 148 pounds, maybe. Next year was a little heavier. Following year. So basically, as the years went on, I competed as lightweight, a welterweight, a middleweight, then light heavyweight. And so kind of fast forward there, I was going to school. I was going to school originally I was looking at medical fields, so like physical therapy. And right around that time, they changed it from a master's degree to PhD. And I was like, nah, I don't like it enough. Like, I don't like it enough to go $200,000 or $300,000 in debt.
And what? 3 more years.
I just didn't. Right. Yeah. So I did all the prereqs. So I had all that stuff already there. So I basically just switched my major over to nutrition, finished school, but I was already personal training people in person and, doing some dietary stuff on the side. And by around 22 years old, I was full time already. That's all that I did. I was broke as hell. I lived in an apartment. And back then, online coaching, I mean, I could count on my hands how many people you actually knew that did it. Unlike now, everyone and their mother's online coach. So, I was fortunate enough to get in early and get introduced to some good people. Like I knew John well, Eric Serrano. Eric's probably the one that introduced me a lot into more functional medicine because, of course, me competing 3 years in a row. Crashed my hormones, crashed my thyroid, did all the shit that you shouldn't do. And
so how'd that conversation go? I've been in that office many times.
So originally I had gone to my family doctor because I felt terrible. I'm like, why am I 20 years old? I feel like I can't walk up a flight of stairs, And he's, he checked I finally convinced him to check my hormones. Checks them. I think my total test was 150 nanograms at 20. I never touched any. Keep in mind, I was completely clean. And he's like, well, you just need to, eat better. I'm like, dude, you don't know.
You're bodybuilding.
Yeah. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I got connected with Eric. And of course, we didn't want to immediately jump right onto HRT. We was like, all right, so let's try to gain some body weight back. Let's try to increase the food, reduce the training. And we did. And actually my test was worse after about 6 months. He's like, you're going to have to go on. And the other thing is he's like, I know you're going to keep competing. So realistically, even if we can get your levels up, like what's the sustainability of that long term? So I was prescribed, early 21. I was almost 22. And, then over the years, I'd ran into gastrointestinal issues, digestion issues. So like all that stuff I started implementing into my own coaching. So now the field that's kind of known as like functional health, you'd call it. I was kind of one of the early people on the front end of that, doing specialized testing and looking at things like digestion and microbiome and cortisol and hormones and things and female reproductive and fertility and all that. And so as of now, that's probably about 40 to 50% of my business is that side. And then the other side is competitors. Like last weekend we were in Chicago. I had an open pro bodybuilder in the Chicago Pro. So like I'll have that one day. Next day I've got postpartum mom. Talking about lactation.
Well, that's kind of like the reality that most people don't understand with what a lot of you guys do, is they think you're only working strictly with competitive bodybuilders or strength athletes or whatever it's going to be. And while there are some that do that, most don't.
I think now it's hard to just corner yourself like that, because I think it's difficult because we've seen the need for understanding some of those things. You don't have to be an expert at it necessarily, but just basic things like fatigue management and managing volume and training and stuff that powerlifters have been doing for years. It's like, you can't just give somebody macros and send them on their way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're going to get phased out real quick. No one's going to hire you. And who's going to pay $400 or $500 a month in some cases for that?
Yeah.
You know,
that brings back some memories there where I've worked with some people in the past, and that's kind of what I should probably put a disclaimer out there is I know how to manage those, but that would be what the update was. Here's the macros for the week, or however it would undulate throughout the week, and then put the foods in however you want. That's it. So you'd send your weight, maybe a photo, and then that would be adjusted. And I always wondered, and I did find out later, that's not how the coaches I worked with everybody, because you have different clientele. Some clientele you may be able to do that with,
sure, but
there's still other things that can be going on, which is kind of where, when you get into the gut biome and all the other kind of stuff, is just, let's go back through your competitive career. And as you're competing, each one of these things came on your radar probably at different times, right, which led to you going down the rabbit hole essentially for yourself to be a better competitor. And then that ends up making you a better coach on the side.
Yep.
So what was the first functional health topic you ran into as a competitor outside of the hormones? We already kind of talked about the TRT thing. What was the other ones as they kind of came onto your radar?
I think the next biggest thing was probably more in the digestive realm, because what I was finding was, now I had competed frequently, so I never really had like a proper off season. So I'm like, I'm going to do this, I'm in 2 years, I'm going to eat, I'm going to just hammer the weights because I love training. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, shit, I can't eat anymore. why am I bloated all the mm-hmm. time? It's why am I having loose stools? Like, why is all this shit going on? And so, well, there's got to be something to this. I can't possibly grow and absorb nutrients and things if I'm functioning mm-hmm. this way. And I think what it did for me was it just made me more aware of recognizing these things with clients, because back in that time, people weren't asking those questions. So it wasn't being reported back to you as a coach. You have like a check-in form that mm-hmm. has whatever, your weight, some
image,
basic, some basic feedback,
cardio,
but no one knew to even report that stuff to you because no one was asking those questions. So I'm like, I'm going to ask more questions, because I was finding that it's like, well, why do some of these clients, it's just basic math. I take away calories, they lose weight and they lose body fat. I give calories, they gain weight, they mm-hmm. increase dose, they get bigger, they get stronger. Like, mm-hmm. but why is it not working for some of these other people? Like, what am I missing? And of course, I started asking more questions, and I'm like, okay, they're not digesting their food. They're not able to eat. They have terrible acid reflux. They have, whatever. They've been having shit for 3 days, mm-hmm. So as I asked more questions, I started realizing how actually widespread those issues were, especially in my bodybuilding population, because especially like my male bodybuilders, I mean, you're just taught like, eat as much as you possibly can. It's funny because one of the off seasons, I was eating I got up, I was like 7,200 calories a day. Mm-hmm. Like third of it was liquid, because I'm just, I'm just like, I want to die every second of the day. I'm sitting, and I remember at the end of it, there was a point, I'm getting ready to get in the shower. I'm sitting on the toilet. I'm like trying to finish this meal. I'm just like butt ass naked on the toilet. And then I puke all over just down the front of myself. And I'm like, dude, there's got to be a different way to do that. Like this kid, like,
well, at the same time, are you calculating how many calories you just puked out?
I got to go back to the kitchen.
You got to get it back in.
I got to go back to the kitchen again.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and the funny thing, about it was when I dieted back down, I'm like, I gained 5 pounds. Like what? For what? Mm-hmm. So it's like, there's got to be more to this. And so, of course, all those things led me to continue to get into these topics more and more and more. And it translated heavily over into the clients. And then I I would say beyond that, getting more into like the stress management piece was huge, because I'm like, so what are the drivers of this things beyond food? Because I'm getting these female clients and stuff that come from these like yo-yo dieting, over dieting backgrounds. They prepped my bikini competitors. They prepped like 6 times a year for the last 5 years. I'm like, well, why are they having digestive issues? And understanding how stress played into that and how that affected their nervous system and digestive motility and all that other stuff. Throw some birth control in there, throw some antibiotics in there. And man, it's a complex topic, but the stress piece was the one that really drove it home for me, and understanding that was, no matter what, that was always a component for everyone. But it could be, stress could be like environmental, like your job or your husband-wife relationship, could be your training. It could be someone's training, doing 2 a day, 7 days a week. And it's like, maybe that's the problem, or it's some accumulation, understanding like that allostatic load type of thing. Like it's like a pie chart, it's like,
there's a lot of things that go into that. So there's some of the questions that were going through my head. If somebody's carb cycling, for instance, you may have, calories on one day of 2,000 calories, the next day of 6,000. That's going to affect, your digestion for sure. So then you have the stress component, physical, mental, all the other kind of stuff, and food component. If they're eating the same foods all the time, are they going to develop allergies from those foods?
Right.
And so when you're asking these questions of these people, it's literally everything that's associated in their life that you have to kind of peel through.
Yep.
What seems to be I don't want to make it seem like it's with everybody, but what seems to be the lowest hanging fruit? Like after 15 years, there's going to be certain things that it can be 100 different things, but usually it's always these 10 or 15.
I think the biggest piece is people's just general lack of awareness.
Okay.
So that's kind of like, how do we get them to report when they don't know? So like, and this just as well as me, is you just grind until you just fall over. It's like eventually you just have to stop because you just can't, something breaks, it's like, but how do you get through to that person that maybe there's a point before that where things might be an issue? So that like idea of perceived stress is difficult to teach people. So maybe we have to use like biomarkers, like looking at their blood glucose or their resting heart rate. And the thing is, like, those things are good. Then that's also a slippery slope, because people are hyper focused on numbers and shit, and they start obsessing about stuff. So now the next thing I've got them like, shit, coach, should I wear a continuous glucose monitor to check my glucose? I'm like, no. Now we're driving a new stress. So I think that building awareness around the things that actually stress them and bother them and cause the problems in the first place is like, that's step one. And they normally tell me, they tell me without knowing. They normally will report it. So they'll kind of like spill the beans, and then they'll say, well, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I'm like, you just it's like, go back and reread what you just sent me. Like everything that happened last week. I'm like, you just word vomited, all this stuff. And so I have to, go through and make them aware of that. So once we can get that accomplished, and some people are great at it and some people are not great at it, then we can start peeling back the layers, and they can actually work on managing those issues. And that's where the lowest hanging fruits, the easiest stuff is quantifiable. Training's always the easiest because
summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link.
That's a number thing. I can adjust the volume. I can adjust the sets and the reps and the RPE or RIR or whatever, like, you know, whatever you want to use. That I can quantify. Just telling someone to relax is like, like how, you know, there, you know, some people like have them meditate, have them go out and do this. I said, you ever tried to sit down and meditate when you're anxious as hell? I said, there's going to be demons all over in your head and, you know, sitting on each shoulder, and it's going to be difficult to do. So sometimes it can be something as simple as you need a hobby, man. Like, what else do you enjoy? Do you have a hobby? Like, no, all I do is sit home and eat meals and watch TV and, you know, go to the gym and go back to work. I'm like, okay, well, let's find something else that you can derive a little bit of joy from, you know? So distractions can be helpful there. But like I said, everyone's a little bit different. Some people, I think, they deal with a lot of trauma and things from, you know, so it's habitual. You know, the behaviors are habitual. So that's where it's like, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a licensed therapist. So sometimes I have to outsource on some of that stuff and be like, listen, it's not personal. I just think that you're doing some shit to yourself I'm concerned about. You know, we're talking like disordered eating and different patterns like that are just really, really bad. And I am not licensed or qualified to tell you how to fix these things, even if maybe I can. So I have to maybe outsource and work with people in that way, because we're all neurotic. We're all type A, we're all OCD. You know, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder when I was in my early 20s. I had depression all through my childhood. And then eventually they realized it was more of an OCD tendency. And it's like, well, no wonder I'm good at this shit. You know, but it was debilitating until I learned how to channel it into my work and channel it into being like task oriented and scheduling and doing all the other stuff. It just owned my life, like everything, because OCD and most of it's a control thing, right? It's like we want to be in control. We want to be in control of the numbers and control of our destiny and control of our goals. It's like sometimes you gotta let someone else be in control.
Well, stress is a weird thing because it's so broad, right? And then with that, and we'll keep training as the example because it's the simplest, right? Is you can have somebody that say their stress or their cup is overfull because of the training aspect, and you can dial their training back and then keep dialing it back, but that's not going to be the actual solution, because they actually may need to be able to grow, or for the stimulus that they need, higher work capacity. So the Band-Aid or the pause, I guess, is to dial it back, but then they have to increase their tolerance to be able to handle more stress. And that would be the same thing with anything that they're dealing with in work, life, or whatever. You can always pull the stressor away, but you're living a very fucking naive life to think that other stressors aren't going to take its place, because they're always there. So as a coach, when you're dealing with all these different aspects, nutrition may be a little bit different, right? Because if you have foods that are actually stressing you, you can pull those away, maybe reintroduce them, you know, in low quantities,
right?
You know, to build it back up again. But over time, the goal is to increase that stress tolerance, because if all we're doing is mitigating, then they're going to suck at everything. You know, so how do you keep that facet in mind? I mean, it's one of the reasons why people will put deloads into training, right? Is to be able to put it in there, to be able to put it back up. But bodybuilding training, and we'll get into it a little bit later, is a little bit different than, well, it's better now. It's a little bit different because it used to be so unphasic. It was ridiculous.
Right.
And so that can create just an ongoing increase of volume. This has always been an interesting thing. If you look over, 40, 50 years, you'll see this ongoing trend of high volume. Those programs, popular. Then there's a tilt, and then it's all low volume.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the greatest thing in the world. And everybody's like, man, I had no idea I was doing so much shit. Then I started doing this other thing and I just got everything grew like crazy.
Right.
And then you'll see that come back up. That pendulum will swing and to the other direction because they just become so accustomed, to what they're doing. But I can also preempt this by saying I don't pay as much attention to this as I used to before. I haven't seen that pendulum. I've seen it try. Like we kind of saw the Mentor stuff try to come back 6 months ago, but it didn't last very long. So I think that we've killed that high volume, low volume pendulum with the number of people putting educational content out there with that. But to get back to the original question is, how do you kind of navigate that? Because it could be something that they just need to increase that tolerance, but you have issues that you have to deal with immediately to be able to lower that.
Yeah. So when it comes to stress, it's all perception. It's not elimination.
Yes.
Right. Like, and I always can use myself as an example is I'm twice as busy and have twice as much stress. If you looked at it on paper, like if you wrote it down, like responsibilities and things and schedule, but I'm not more stressed than I was with half the workload. So like, how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it's just, you get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's just an element of like, it's like a great example is I had a client the other day, not calling her out, but dropped a weight on hurt her thumb. It's like, can't train for 2 weeks. I'm like, oh, why?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, but if you've never been hurt before, that might seem like a big deal. If you have something, you've been hurt a bunch of times, you have something major happen, you're immediately thinking, all right, what am I going to do tomorrow to work around this?
If it's a thumb, you're like,
right.
No big deal.
Whatever.
Yeah. It's not a hamstring.
So it's like you do become more accustomed to it because what used to be a 10 is probably a 3 now, because you've basically just been acclimated to it. So, I mean, I think that's an element of it, but also I think that a lot of it is just understanding that it's going to be there no matter what, and you can't run from it and you can't hide from it. And the thing I find funny about bodybuilders and powerlifters and high performing people is I tell them, like, you're going to do it anyhow. Why hate it?
Yeah.
It's like, you're going to go home. You're probably going to be a parent, a spouse, you're going to go to work. I'm like, you're not a loser. So I'm like, why hate it? I mean, because your other option is just quit, but I know you're not going to do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, you're going to show up. It's like, we got to change your attitude about what you're doing. Is it going to be hard sometimes? Sure. Are you going to get pissed off sometimes? Sure. But I think that the length in which you are pissed off needs to be reduced.
Yeah.
Getting stressed out is one thing, but letting it ruin your whole week because you stubbed your toe is a whole different story. So I think that's kind of what I found in myself is I still have a response to things, but it's like, I guess that doesn't really matter. Move on. I got other shit to do.
Well, the question is, will this matter in 5 years?
Right. Or 10 minutes. In some cases.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big thing for people is just that, how do I digest that as quick as possible? Because human beings are programmed. There's this article I send out to a lot of people. It talks about how like human beings are programmed we have automatic negative thoughts. We're presented with a situation first that we analyze first with the negatives. We go cons to pros.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we like maybe
reframe,
flip that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that will completely change the way that we respond to situations as a whole. You do that, you get 5% less stress here, 10%, 10%, 10%. Over time, I can take that 10% and push it into your volume, push it into your nutrition, push it into your cardio. And now our work capacity goes up and up and up and up and up and up.
Yeah. So with the gut health and it falling back, with that being the one consistent thing across everybody, I'm going to assume what they're looking for is a probiotic, or something like that. So while this is going on, and because this is a long process of controlling or making them aware of the negative stressors, because that's probably more the case than anything else, is they're stressed, but they really don't, they're not aware. They know they're stressed, right? But they're not aware to pause and then ask the questions that we just did, like, will this matter in 10 minutes?
Right.
Will this matter in 5 years? Is this even anything I can change because it happened 10 years ago and I'm just freaking out about it now? Or is it something that won't manifest in the future? And these are questions you can ask, to be able to mitigate all that. But my assumption is that they're just going to want to know what supplement to take, because if it's training, they're going to want to know what the best exercise for their chest is.
Right.
And there's no real answer to that. So how do you address that?
So let's assume we've got the stress thing. We've already beat that to death. So we kind of uncovered that.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, what I've really found, especially in the last few years, and I've kind of, as I put these pieces together, is that one of the biggest things with digestion as a whole is, as ironic as it sounds, is the nutrition that we have as bodybuilders especially is way too narrow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we're looking at microbiome, for one, the research, and we have it, but there's so many trillions of bacteria, we don't even know what all the strands are. It's like you can't possibly do it. So I use certain stool testing and stuff, and you can measure and check things, but it's still limited. I mean, it doesn't show everything. But when you're eating the same 4 foods for 5, 10, 15 years, you got chicken, beef, rice, potato, maybe. And if you're in the off season, you sure aren't eating any vegetables because there's no room in your stomach. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Food volume's too high, right? So like when we're doing that repetitively, our microbial diversity narrows down. So we kind of are broken up into 2 major categories. We have like commensal bacteria, which is considered, the good stuff generally. And then we have what we would call like opportunistic or dysbiotic bacteria. So these are like the bad bugs. And they're called opportunistic because they'll eat anything. They're like raccoons, they'll go in the dumpster.
Where are these settling? We're talking the stomach, the intestines?
Mostly intestinal tract, right? So we think, and the reason for that's mainly because of pH environment. Stomach's really acidic. So like you don't have too much bacteria lives in there. You can get like a H. pylori infections, for example, acid reflux. A lot of that stuff's coming from the upper GI.
So then how's it getting to the intestines if it's not getting there through the stomach?
So most of the food is actually fermented in the intestines, right? So the bacteria that's in there is once the food gets down there, because so in the stomach, it's broken down into like a paste, right? Yeah. And then it's emptied down in the intestines, and then your body starts feeding on it. The bacteria feed on it. So really, depending on what you put in there will dictate which bugs feed on what and which bugs are able to like repopulate themselves and grow and expand. So when you have a case where we're having like this dysbiosis, that's kind of like the general blanket term, the bad bugs are probably out feeding the good bugs, right? So there's all kinds of variations to that. I mean, you may have plenty of good bugs, but you just have way too many of the bad ones, or you may have none of the good ones and all the bad ones, or you may have a normal amount of the bad ones and none of the good ones, right? So, but in any case, the ratio is skewed. So what those do is when those bad bugs kind of populate themselves to a high level, they produce hydrogen and methane gases. So when you do like if you were to go to a gastro-doc and they did a SIBO, like a small intestine bacterial overgrowth test, probably wouldn't do it. But if you got one that did, it's a breath test. So they would test like how much of that you're blowing out essentially. And that would tell you how much of that's being produced in that intestinal tract, right? But that's what causes that lower intestinal bloating. A lot of people think it's just like food in there, but most of these people that have that overgrowth, they're waking up like that. Like they haven't eaten for 8-10 hours and they're waking up. And I see it especially in my clients that are leaner, females especially, because they have these torsos are real small. They turn to that side profile, boop, right there, right in that pelvic area. I'm assuming it's not like a menstrual cycle thing, and that it's pretty noticeable because I'll get these people that are like ab, boom. It's like blown up with those gases, right? And so half the time I can see that. I'm like, well, I mean, I already know what's going on there before we even dig into it. So kind of going back to the nutrition, one of the very first lines of defense we have is creating more diversity in that diet. And we've been just kind of conditioned over time to eat certain things. And then it's funny because we went from that, then we went to the, like, if anyone's been around long enough, they went to the, if it fits your macros, just like calories in, calories out, because we know that's really what dictates weight loss, essentially. And then we got back to, well, that's not good because it's too much processed stuff, whatever. And then we got into, now what kind of foods do we eat? So now we're kind of like in this space where people are trying to understand how to program in foods. And for general population, it's easy because they're not trying to eat 5,000-6,000 calories, 4,000 calories. So it's like healthy, balanced diet, man. You know, if I can get 2 to 3 different types of fruits and veggies in there, and sometimes they're not very tolerant of that. So you kind of have to introduce it a little slower and assess. Man, we're rocking. I mean, that's a great base to start with. That's not to say that we won't have to do anything else, but I've got a good base to start diversifying that bacteria.
So it's slowly introducing other foods back, sort of if somebody was to have a food allergy test or whatever, if they had to go on an elimination diet because they're did one of those tests and they're allergic to like 8,000 different things.
Right.
And then you slowly would, so it's the same kind of philosophy there where you're going to slowly add back different foods.
Yep.
So you know what's the culprit.
Now, the tricky part, I think the tricky part about this is what we're seeing now is, since there's so many people talking about this stuff, that people are doing these elimination type diets for too long periods of time. And so now we're just creating the same issue again. So they're like, I'm going to do elimination diet, or I'm going to do a paleo diet, or I'm going to do a keto diet, or I'm going to do a, whatever, insert whatever you want. Or low FODMAP diet, to reduce fermentation, because that will reduce the amount of, bacteria that's fed. And they get symptom relief from it. Right. Then they get to me and they're like, I've been doing this for 2 years. And I'm like, so you don't have overgrowth anymore because you weren't feeding it, but now you just don't have anything. You just wiped everything out. So it's like, you can't stay on any of those for extended periods of time. Like, none of them are long-term solutions. They can provide symptom relief, but we have to get to a point where we have that diversity in the diet. And it doesn't, there's a lot of different opinions on this. I'm not someone that thinks that it's like everything you eat has to be like organic and, whatever. It's like, if you want to do that, great. I'm all about food quality, especially if you can fund it. Cool. I understand some people can't. Yeah. And that's no problem. But we do have to get to a point where it shouldn't be a case where you can't eat blueberries. You know what I mean? Like we got a problem. And I always know that when they come in and they're like, I can't eat, and they name off like 10 things. I was like, you're not allergic to chicken. Probably not. Yeah. It's the reason that you have all of these food allergies is the fact that you have an underlying GI issue to begin with, right? There's no reason, because people that have food allergies have allergies. Like, if you have a peanut allergy, you're going to go into anaphylaxis. You're going to EpiPen. Like, that's a whole different, you have celiac disease. Like, these are life-threatening issues. Most of our food allergies are just like underlying, gastrointestinal issues. So like I said, kind of going back, just building that base of varieties is step one.
Well, when you look at that hierarchy, for lack of a better word, so I know a lot of people that have had, the food testing done with, whatever was trending 8 years ago, and it comes back with this huge list. And so that's one marker. Blood work can be another marker, where one of the questions I've always had with blood work is if your gut and your intestines are not actually digesting and assimilating the micronutrients the way that they should, then the blood work, the things that are off in the blood work may not actually be off in the blood work. Granted, they are, but they're not causation.
Right.
So would the gut health be higher in that hierarchy, than the blood work for what we're speaking about? Because obviously, if there's other symptoms or other issues, blood work is going to be a gold standard there.
Yeah. So there's a couple things there, like what tests Like, what testing can you use and how would it reflect in your testing? So if we're thinking like, let's say person comes in, common scenario, they have some type of bacterial overgrowth, see it all the time. Like, what would that actually do to your blood work? What would you look for? And it could be a variety of things, but stuff you're going to see potentially would be like white blood cell markers. You could see if you have a really, really prominent overgrowth, you might see like elevation in your neutrophils or elevation in your eosinophils, or even some of those being low. And that would indicate suppressed immune function or that the white blood cells are actively attacking something, right? So that could be an indication. Inflammatory markers, because we test things like C-reactive protein, and there's ESR, and there's a couple different ones. And a lot of those are usually associated with like cardiac, cardiac markers. But I'm seeing these things in absence of any cardiac issues whatsoever. It's like systemic inflammation from the gut. So we may see those be off. Hormones are a big one, especially in women. So one that I'm commonly seeing is like extremely elevated estrogen levels, because estrogen's interesting because they produce it from the ovaries. Males aromatize it from testosterone, right? But we have to excrete hormones, right? We have to get rid of them. So if we're not, they can recirculate back into the body and those levels stay elevated. So we have in one of the GI map tests, I can talk about that. It's like a stool test. One of the things it measures is a marker called beta glucuronidase. It's kind of an enzyme that shows this detox, right? So we're getting a lot of these females and even men that are not detoxing this stuff. So they're having, like, guys are like pounding AIs and stuff on 150 milligrams of on TRT because their estrogen's so elevated. And I'm like, well, it's because you're not detoxing anything. It's like we all aromatize a little differently, how much body fat you have and genetics and all that stuff. But I'm like, your estradiol is not 150 on that dose. Like, you're not detoxing it. It's all coming back in the body. Or I'm seeing these women with estradiol of like 500 on there. Right. And it's screwing up their menstrual cycles. So what do? They go to the doctor. Doctor tries to throw them on birth control, whatever. It's like, lo and behold, they actually have gut issues. So like that can manifest on the blood work. There's other things you can see, definitely nutrient deficiencies, like looking in the CBC, like in the red blood cells. So there's like alkaline phosphatase. We have zinc and magnesium deficiencies. We can see the CBC would have like your red blood cells, but also have the size of the red blood cells. And it would kind of indicate like B vitamins and iron status and things like that. Those can easily be off. And it's always a dead giveaway when I have guys like that. I'm like, you don't have an iron deficiency. You're eating 250 grams animal protein every day. Yeah. Like, you don't, like, there's no way that you're deficient in vitamin B12 and iron, at least from a intake standpoint. It's that they're not absorbing it. Right. So you see stuff like that. It's blatantly obvious that we have some kind of absorption issues. Like, a lot of that stuff can manifest in the blood work. So
the blood work could then be that higher hierarchy, to delve down into this.
Yeah.
Thyroid. Especially if it's not symptomatic.
Right. Thyroid would be another one. Even seeing like issues with like your T4 to T3 conversion, that would manifest from GI issues. So, and the reason I like blood work first is because it just gives me a lot of other stuff too. I can run these GI maps and the tests, and it's like a $400 test. Not everyone's ready to dish that out, especially when they got to pay me and they got to buy the supplements and do all the other stuff. So, but with blood work, I can at least get a pretty good idea, and then I can match that up with the symptoms that they have. And I can also get an idea of their hormones and their thyroid and, whatever blood glucose, insulin levels. Like, I can see all that stuff. So I think blood work is probably the most bang for your buck there. And just because it's just giving us a broader outlook.
And speaking of the blood work, I should shout out one of our sponsors, Merrick Health. So the link is in the description. We have 2 panels up there. There's the full panel, which we'll talk a little bit more about blood work here to kind of explain the difference between what people actually should be doing and what they actually are doing, or what doctors are having them do, which is I'm speechless, so that just kind of leave it with that.
Me.
But anyhow, the link is in the description. You get 10% off your first order. The panels are there that we have, and they've been vetted out with pretty much everything. Every guest I've ever sat with talks about blood work. The full panels covering everything that everybody says. They have professionals there that can help, and been a sponsor of the podcast since we brought it back up. So with that in mind, with the blood work, the reason why I've been fortunate as yourself, because Dr. Serrano has been my doctor since like 1990 or something like that. So
the year I was born.
Yeah. So I never really knew that it was as big of an issue than people would tell me, because I really never had that. I was competing and he was trying to help me mitigate, which I wasn't very compliant at that time, but trying, later in time, it meant a little bit more, because mitigating became more of an issue than what it was when I was younger. But what I hear even today from people just blows my mind is, A, they can't get the blood work, or if they get the blood work, it's just basically a cholesterol screen. And that's it.
Yep.
Or, I mean, I can just keep going down the line with all this kind of stuff. Now, on the other side, with, all these TRT clinics, I call them hair test club for men.
Yeah.
That are popping up everywhere. I don't even know if they're even doing blood work half the time. It's just like, here's your test, here's your AI, and to your point, 150 milligrams of test and a boatload of AI. And here's your HCG or whatever the fuck else they can be able to put on there. And that, I don't want to say it's worse than black market, but it's an issue, because a lot of people will think that's what this is supposed to look like, because they don't know any different. And then at some point they get a hold of a coach that knows what they're talking about. And you're not a doctor, you can't prescribe and all that, but you can educate.
Yeah.
Right. And then when they speak to somebody that really knows what they're doing, then they realize, I don't want to say scammed, but it's kind of a fraud, a lot of these clinics with what they're doing, because obviously they don't have that person's health in mind, because they're not doing that. Exactly. Yeah. They're just making money. And now they may be good for sourcing, so, I mean,
having a legal script.
Yeah. I mean, that has value, but having somebody that knows what they're doing to be able to walk through these indicators, kind of like what you were doing earlier, is, is this gut health? Is this some other factor? If you're eating all the meat, then obviously iron and B's should be high,
right?
And I'm not sure a lot of these clinics have professionals that even go that far. They'll just look for the red lines and say, okay, this is off. Your B's off, so here's a B vitamin. Iron's off. Here's an iron. Now, the question I would have with that is, when they go down that route, does it even go up with the supplementation, because it's probably not going to be absorbed, because something's stopping that absorption to begin with. Or if vitamin D is kind of another interesting one, where you can have people taking, what's the typical dose? 10,000 a year,
10,000,
80,000.
Right.
And it won't go up.
Right.
And it's like, well, maybe, you know what I'm saying? I'm just hypothesizing here, but maybe there's something disrupted, something that's causing that to not go up.
Right.
Because 10,000 should probably do the job.
For sure.
So,
yeah. So, I've been lucky enough to talk to some of a couple people that own these clinics, and one clinic I work with a lot. And then also there's another lady that I helped her with a lot of education before she started her clinic and stuff. And it's the difference. So, when you're looking at our typical going to your physician, one, they don't know, because they're just not educated on it. I mean, that's just, even if they want to know, even if they want to try, they just don't. I mean, Eric's great, because Eric has probably self-educated himself over the years. And two, they're tied down by insurance. They're reactive instead of proactive. It's like they can't.
Which Eric doesn't take that either.
Right. Exactly. So it's like a great, you hurt yourself. They're like, well, you got to do all this physical therapy before we'll give you an MRI. It's like, well, why? But their hands are tied on a lot of this stuff. So like when you're going in and getting a blood panel, like you said, you might get the CBC and you get your renal markers checked maybe in your cholesterol panel. They're not going to check your hormones. They're not going to do any of this stuff. And if they do, they're using these obscenely huge ranges that are like my doctor, for example, he's like, well, you're 1 point in range. I'm like, dude, I'm 20 years old. You know, like I should be walking around looking at anything and just being like aroused. You know, it's like, this is not okay. And but then you go to the other side, which is the clinics, and they have the power to prescribe. But what I've noticed, and I'm not mentioning anyone specifically, is a lot of them, they'll have an owner and they have a prescribing, it's generally either an NP, like a nurse practitioner. And I'm assuming they probably use NPs a lot just because they can pay them less than MDs. But they'll have that. They'll have a prescriber, but it's very disconnected. You know what I mean? They'll have like the company that the compounding pharmacy, you know what I mean? They're trying to make money off them and they got to deal with them and they're doing this thing. And then they've got the prescriber who's kind of like disconnected from the thing. And they're just like, well, this person's got this, give them this, without any real effort to look at those other areas. And like you said, you start giving them these things, and some of the better ones might suggest the nutrients and the other things. But to your point, that doesn't fix. I mean, it still doesn't fix. It's better than nothing, but it really doesn't fix any of the underlying issues. So it's unfortunately, it's like, maybe I don't know if that's better than going to your physician. I feel like it probably is in some cases.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's probably a lot of downsides there too. And unfortunately, people get like overprescribed, for example. Like I'm getting these women coming in, you get this 50-year-old woman that's not a competitor or anything, and she's getting prescribed, test replacement, and she comes in, her test is like 500 nanograms per deciliter. I'm like, oh my God. Like, she goes, I've been having a lot of hair growth and acne and my voice is changing. I'm like, whoa, this is not okay. I said, do you know what a male range is? I'm like, male range is like 800 or 900,000 maybe on the high end. I said, you should be like 100 or less. And she's like, why are they doing this to me? So it's like, I don't know, man. I don't know what the answer exactly is. I think that you had mentioned it earlier, and the best thing I can do is just educate people as much as possible so they're equipped with the right questions and the right knowledge when they go into, because you have to be proactive with your health when you're going in there, and you have to kind of advocate for yourself. You have to push them sometimes. They'll do a little bit more if you push them to do it. Maybe you have to get a new doctor. I don't know.
Yeah. My question is going to be, what would be some of those questions? But before I get to that question, what I've seen is with myself and with others is when you are advocating and you are actually asking good questions, your doctor that you may think is not a very good doctor becomes a very good doctor, because you got to put yourself in their position, especially say you're a personal trainer and one day you have 10 clients. And 9 of those clients really don't even want to be there. They're there because their doctor said they have to be there. All they really want to do is walk on the treadmill. It's just a pain in the ass. And one does, and if you have that over a period of 2 years, you're going to form this bias, that most people just don't give a fuck. So here's my, template of just basic shit to be able to have them do, because they're not going to commit beyond a level 2.
Right.
And this works for the level 2 and it's all fine. I think the physicians are that way too.
Yep.
Most of the people are coming in, they really don't want to hear lifestyle health advice because they're not going to do it. They don't care about it. They just want whatever pill to be able to fix that. Then over a period of time, that's 90% of who they see, until they have that one person that then asks a question to where they're like, put yourself as that trainer. Now you get that one client, you're like, holy shit, I want to work with this person. Right. You know what I'm saying? It makes your whole day, when that person comes in, because they give a shit, they're going to work hard, they care, they're going to follow the advice, and they're going to challenge where your intellect is and maybe create an environment where you have to learn more.
Right.
I'm making a broad assumption that most physicians are probably that way too.
Yeah, I would think most of them are, and then you get the small percentage that their ego doesn't allow them to be.
Yes,
They're like, "How dare you ask?
Yeah.
How dare you challenge my?"
Well,
my
sometimes what I
instruction?"
found is with, because I'm that person, is if it's a specialist, you'll run into that a lot, right? So secret that I've kind of learned is I wait until it's just myself and the specialist without any grad assistants or interns or anybody else that's in there. Then I'll pose the question. Then there's no threat. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Where if he has those other people around, then you pose a question. I think, hypothesizing, being a fake psychologist here, that there's a threat in some way to where they're like, you're questioning my authority and
Right.
you're doing it in front of these people.
Right.
And I've had success with that,
Sure.
So once you clear them and you're like, can you explain to me exactly what you mean by I should never lift 40 pounds again?
Right.
And you would give that same suggestion to somebody who's a 60-year-old grandma, like,
Right.
why 40 pounds?
Yeah.
Why not 30? But it's framed a little bit better. Like, what are we trying to avoid here? Is it a Valsalva maneuver? Is it blood pressure? Is it, X, Y, or Z? And then it's that's there. But when there's an audience, it's not going to happen.
It's like a off the record conversation. You definitely, and I find that with a lot of experts, you know what I mean? Especially when you're in front of a crowd or doing something, it's difficult too, because if they're talking and they have the interns in there, they got the grad students, you're also talking in generalities a lot too.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Versus getting very specific and kind of like looking at the context of somebody's case.
So what would be the questions that people should be thinking of when they're going in, to see a physician for longevity? That's another word that's really weird to me as well. Like, what the hell does that even mean?
Right.
We can all die for whatever reason, just out of the,
right.
It's another ill-defined word, but for discussion's sake, if they're going in for that, what are some of the questions that they should be thinking about?
So I think the first thing is understanding who they are as a demographic and what their risks or potential issues might be. Because my questions of myself might be different than, my 40-year-old mom going in. So I should understand, like, am I more concerned about hormones or gastrointestinal health, or what is it? And then we can start posing the questions. So I think that first and foremost is just knowing what your symptoms are and what they might be correlated to, because you're not going to get the blood work that you want and the things that you want if you don't know what you're actually asking for.
Well, let me pause you with that one, because getting back to the gut health, a lot of people won't even register that that's a symptom for them. That morning, they may have, blown ass like it's coming out of a garden hose.
Right.
And then asked 4 hours later, how's your digestion? It's good.
Right.
So it's with what you're saying in mind, what I would put out there to people is really think about that first. Like, what, just across the board, what are you taking for granted that could be abnormal, that is abnormal when you're doing it, like when you're, splattering in the toilet in the morning 4 times before you leave the house.
Right. It's this is normal for me. I'm like, no, it's not normal for anyone.
Yeah.
So even just having an honest, just kind of symptom assessment of yourself, and just like, what does my day look like from top? Like, am I fatigued? What do I feel? Am I going to the bathroom every day? Is it formed? Like, does it resemble something that is formed? Is it liquid? Looking at basic stuff. Am I getting signs of, high blood pressure all the time? Am I getting headaches a lot? Am I having symptoms that might resemble like allergies or skin or things like that? So I would say you having an honest conversation with yourself, and kind of just maybe even writing a list before you go in. Because if you're just kind of put on the spot, you're likely going to answer whatever you perceive as normal because you're used to it. And I will say that that is about the worst thing you can do, because if I just, like, for example, if I gave someone a questionnaire as a new client and I left out those things, they wouldn't tell them to me.
Yeah.
They just wouldn't tell me. But when I start asking the questions, they're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I'm going through these questions and they're starting to uncover all these things that they've been essentially ignoring over and over and time again. And, you'd be surprised what, you'd be surprised what they could find. I find out that they haven't gone to the bathroom in 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, well, I never go to the bathroom for 3 days. I'm like, that's problematic.
Yeah.
That's problematic. But even then, like, even if you ask all those questions, unfortunately, you still may fall short in terms of the care that you've received. But luckily there are people, we have people like myself and other people that can help. Now, I think and this may be a good conversation for us, I think the difficult part of this is there's a barrage of information right now.
Mm-hmm.
So like, we are so overwhelmed. And you said it earlier, take a probiotic for digestion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you have this symptom and this symptom and this symptom? You should take whatever. Dude, it's insane. Like, you open up the internet and you're going to think that you have testicular cancer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like,
well, everybody's subjected to that too, because if I'm scrolling through Instagram at least once a day, and I'm not on there as much as people would think, but at least once a day, I'm going to see some shit that's like an entrepreneur thing or some AI type of thing. And it's a slider post and it will stop and I'll look through there and I'll think, oh shit, this, then you pause and you're like, no, this is bullshit. This guy's not making 30,000 a month because of this stupid AI digital ebook thing or whatever it is,
right.
And so the way that I've always thought about that is, if it's stopping me for a second and I kind of know better on most of these things, then it's definitely stopping everybody else. And we'll definitely go down this rabbit hole. But before that, one thing that I've changed with my own blood panels over the last 2 years is, because your blood work is still just a marker in a space and time. Right. It can be different 2 days later, 3 days later.
For sure.
I don't know how this came to me, but one day it's, if I ever need to take my weight up or down and I have to track my macros, I don't even make any attempt on what I'm doing with that until I track it for a week. So my Calorie King or whatever the fuck I use, just don't change it. Maybe they don't know this, so I'll spell it out, right? So if you track all your macros for a week and you don't change anything, and the trick here is don't change the shit, and most people probably do. You can side with me on this if you found this to be true. As soon as they start tracking things, they start eating a little bit cleaner. Right. So you can't do that.
Right.
And then you'll get an idea of what your normal calorie intake is, can adjust from there. So I took that same philosophy and I'm like, okay, I'm going to track everything I do for a week before the blood work. Like, so how many times in the morning am I taking a shit? It's what is my stress level work wise? What is the training? I try to get as much information as I can for that week leading into that, because what happens, and I get my blood work before I see the physician. I learned I don't like the other way. Right. You go in and you have the conversation, they take the blood work and they call you on the phone and say, this is fucked up. This is fucked up. But no, I want it first.
Yep.
And then I'll go in. But not only can I go in, then when they ask, what have you been doing differently? I can say, well, I can't give you the whole past 3 months, but here's the things that were leading into that week. And a lot of those stressors can open conversations.
Right.
Like, well, is this normal? Well, it was for that week, so I'm going to assume it. But anyhow, that helps with that. And it's not that hard to do. I mean, we all have notepads on our phone.
Yeah.
You just jot down, I was pissed off 8 times today, and
right.
Is that good or bad? Well, after 7 days, you're going to know,
right?
Well, it's normal, or actually it's higher than normal. And that can express itself in cortisol, a lot of different things it can express itself on.
Yeah. It's, and I'm sure you would agree with this, when you do something long enough, all coaching is pattern recognition, right?
Yeah.
It's like, people talk about, I coach intuitively. I'm like, no, You coach, you're intuitive because you recognize patterns because you've done it 9,000 times. And that's what all of that is like when you're looking at a situation is recognizing patterns, but there's not really a way. You might be able to recognize a certain pattern in someone that because you've seen it in other people, but you don't really have a good baseline on them until they get that week food log, until they get that week symptom assessment, until they've checked in 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So it's like, and people, because again, people are inundated with all this information, and I start them on something. I'm like, I need you to not touch anything. I need you to report honestly. And I need you to just not worry about any of this stuff. Let me look at it. Give me some check-ins. Let me see what's affecting you. I can point out things like stress triggers that may be causing digestive distress. They're like, well, I'm having loose stools or I'm really bloated. And then I just come to realize that the only times that they're bloated is when they're stressed out. I'm like, okay, we got a stress issue. We may not even have any. I may not need to have you spend $400 on this test over here. So that's why having that baseline for people is so important, because I know in my industry, like people are so quick to jump to like doing all these things when we've got, you mentioned low hanging fruit earlier. It's like, we've got all this other stuff, and I can basically tell you XYZ that's already affecting you. So why don't we start there before we start spending all this money and all this time and freaking out about, all these things.
Well, the way I've always seen it is, if you're not a flat earther, right, we have the earth, then we have an atmosphere that goes around the earth, right? And that atmosphere compared to the earth, let's just say it's the margins, right? Everything that these people are seeing on social media or on these reels or these slide posts or whatever it is always shit in the margins.
Yep.
Always, right? Diet soda. I mean, we can just go through a list of 100 different things. But what doesn't sell and what doesn't get clicks and what doesn't stop the scroll is the main shit.
Yep.
And that's, a message that everybody's been trying to drive home for the longest period of time. And I think that a lot of coaches will avoid really speaking about a lot of those things because they don't think it has the glitz and it's going to stop the scroll and all this other kind of stuff. Or they think that it's just overplayed. Everybody's been saying these things for decades. But what they forget is, while that is true, you haven't been saying it, for decades. And the changing the messenger can change everything. I'm sure you know this with clients that have worked with other people that come to you, and you may be telling them exactly the same thing somebody else did, but now they're compliant. Or clients you may have had to go to somebody else and vice versa. It's just how the message is being communicated.
It's like you can teach anyone anything if you know how to relay the information.
Yes.
Right. Everyone learns differently. Everyone understands differently. You can't speak to people the same way. And that is a lot of the stuff I talk about online. I would tell you, when I first started learning about a lot of this stuff, I spoke a lot more in technicalities, but over time I've simplified.
Well, I think everybody does that.
The way that I speak.
I used to make fun of that, criticize that a little bit, but it's kind of like a bell curve. When you're in high school and you're first learning this stuff, you're reading Muscle and Fitness and all this other stuff. And if you're really inspired, maybe you bought some books, right? Then you learn all the Weider principles and 5 meals a day or whatever the shit was, and you start kind of working your way up this educational curve. Right. And for a while, you're like, man, I kind of know my shit. But then you start learning bigger words.
Yep.
And usually in the training sphere, they start learning words associated with biomechanics and physical therapy. So then their narrative changes, how they speak changes, and they kind of go up that curve. And I can plot where people are on this thing, by the way. And then they get to the top, right? Then they think they know everything, like they can solve everything. And then you stay up there. Not that they are at the top, but their perceived perception is they're at the top.
Dunning-Kruger.
Yes, big words, expert in the field, da. And then they get exposed to more and more people, because as you become more educated, thus does your sources of education that you're looking toward. But then you start finding people like, oh my God, there's no way
right.
I can, then you have imposter syndrome.
Yep.
Right. Because but they're all specialists in that thing. Eventually they kind of make their way back down the other side of the curve to where they're like, man, I don't know a fucking thing.
Yep.
It's right. And everybody kind of does that. Now, how high they go before they start to realize my audience is really the most important thing, not how I present myself, but the messages are being received.
There's and from a business aspect, I think it's interesting because so one of the things I do in my business is I educate a lot of coaches too. So that's like a large part of my business. And one of the things we talk about is like, who are you talking to and who are you trying to attract? Because I can say big words with the best of them. What kind of client is that going to bring in? And if it does bring them in, what kind of preconceived bias are they going to have when they come in? Like, what are they going to expect from me? That's what they're going to want. You know, they're going to want the thing. They're going to want this thing. They're going to want the big word. They're going to want the exercise or the biomechanic tweak or the supplement. I don't want that. Right. Because I know that there's probably a lot of foundational things that are going to be very basic and they're not even going to want to listen to me when I start talking to them. So I think it is important to be careful how you talk. And while it might take a little more time to build a business on that type of theory or that premise, I think it will attract better, more quality people that are more willing to listen to what you're talking about. And you're going to deal less with like really, deal a little bit less with the crazy neurotic people. And you might even get some of those people to change their tune over time. And they realize like there's can be a lot of simplicity in this complex, in these complex topics. So I do think it's important. That's always been my MO is like, I don't want to get caught up in talking like that and attracting those people because social media now it's like the more sensationalistic you are, the more, the more hits you're getting, but you can't coach those people. Like they don't listen. They don't produce results. They don't do anything for your business. They're hard to work with. It's like you're going to spend 95% of your time on 5% of these clients that you're going to get their monthly payment for a few months and they're going to drop off because why? They're going to go to the next guy that has the other big words because you're not giving them what they want. I don't want that. Well,
the other thing that happens with that as well is they're going to be the least likely people to ever give you a referral.
Sure.
Because in their world, if they refer somebody else to somebody, they think that means that person they referred is better than what they are. And they're not going to do that. So from a business perspective, it sucks from so many different areas that from a client perspective, from an education perspective, might be different. Right. Because those might be that market for educational content that's a webinar or something like that. So that's a little different.
It's interesting because I'm in a spot now where I when I talk to the coaches about that, I'm like, you have to understand your audience and who you're talking to, because a lot of them, I'm like, all you're doing is talking to other coaches. Like these people, these are cool words and they sound catchy, but they don't understand what you're saying. It's like all you're doing is talking to the other people that can understand the verbiage that you're using. But it's been difficult for me because I have to talk to both. I have to talk to like both audiences when I'm, when I put out content or talk or get on a podcast and stuff. So it's like, well, where's the middle ground there? So I have to I have to wear like both hats and do both. But I think it depends on the platform, like if I'm at a seminar, speaking at a seminar, it's probably all coaches, right? Everyone there probably has clients. So I'm going to maybe talk a little bit differently than if I'm on a podcast. If I did one a couple weeks ago and she's like, hey, our demographic is all non-competitor general population women. I'm like, okay, tone the volume down, or so there's levels in terms of like what kind of language we're using and how we're presenting ourselves. And I think that's super important to understand when you're putting out content, because people just want like the biggest words, the fanciest, the most sensationalistic. And I'm like, but clicks aside, views aside, who is that actually talking to? I can post a picture of my cat and get, stupid likes. Does that do anything or ROI on my business? No. I mean, it might put me out in the algorithm a little bit, but it doesn't do anything for me, right? Ultimately. So I think that people kind of mistake like popularity and visibility with what's actually helping them, because at the end of the day, if you've been around more than 5 years and 80% of your business isn't referral, you suck.
Yeah. Well, the other part of that is in a way that's kind of insulting the intelligence of the people that would understand the bigger words, because if they can understand the bigger words, then they're going to understand the generalities that you're speaking in.
Right.
And if they know the bigger words and you know the bigger words, you're probably not going to teach them a whole lot about what that is. What they want to know is your take on it.
Yep.
Like, how do you address A, B, and C?
The application, for sure.
The application of all that. So it's not like they're going to be there and, oh, this guy's, well, they shouldn't be there and say, look, this guy's an idiot. But there's always going to be those people that are going to say that just because they want to, make themselves look better than somebody else. But those people aside, most of them just want to know, how do you address this problem?
Right.
Right. And if it's answered in, now the third grade level becomes a little weird for me, especially with GPTs now, because I can take stuff and say, write this at a third grade level. And I'm like, I don't know if this is really
read it back.
Like maybe we got to go like 8th grade, because that maybe it is true. I'm just not very acceptive of that, because it's like, the cat wore a hat, walked down the street. It's just very too simple, to put it out there. And I don't think that in the realm that we kind of all operate in, that we're dealing with that demographic.
Sure. Yeah. So there's, again, like finding that middle ground can be difficult. And some people are, and I tell you, just with having worked with coaches over the years, like you can memorize anything, like I've got protocols out the wazoo for all kinds of stuff, but it doesn't mean you can apply anything. Because if it was, I would just write an ebook, or I would just create an app that was like symptoms, boom, 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 spit it out, and I'd be done. I wouldn't even be sitting here. I'd just be out somewhere, But it doesn't work like that. It's funny because I was talking to a coach yesterday about AI and stuff. And I was like, well, the further we get into this coaching space, the more people are actually having to like coach individuals as individuals. And we're getting further and further away from automation, interestingly enough.
Yes.
Right. And
that's the only way they're going to make it.
Yeah. I'm like, so you can't think of it in terms of automation. I said, if your model is just if you want to write an ebook and you want to do stuff like that and use that quantity model, it can be a good passive income to help supplement people. Like I have classes and things that there's in a marketplace, you buy them, but if you want the full application, you want to know how it applies to each individual, you got to go to the source, right? You got to learn how to work with people, because I can give you protocol for small intestine bacterial overgrowth, but you might have 10 different people that present in 10 different ways, that have 10 different lives and are different genders and different ages. And it's like, we're going to have to adjust. So, memorizing, I can teach a protocol to a junior high student. If they look at it enough, they're going to memorize it and write it down. They can just copy and paste it and put it on their notes on their phone. That doesn't mean they can coach anyone. Like the days of doing that are,
there's way more to it. Where I was asked a couple of weeks ago to create an ebook for like a lead magnet, just like a conjugate template. I'm like, okay, whatever, that will be easy, until I actually started to like really think this through. Right. It's like, and if it was to be, because I looked at it, okay, now if this was to be an app, I need to know, what phase is this going to fall into, and then what day is this, and then how do you feel before you actually came in? Do you need the warm up? Do you not need the warm up? And if you this is then you need to do, and it's like, oh my God, what the hell did I get myself into? Where, the default is the basic template's a basic template, and that might apply for 50% of the demographic that's never done anything like that before. Maybe.
Right.
But then there's that other 50%. This is bullshit. That doesn't work. So it's there. And I am using AI to be able to kind of help, build this whole thing out. But the realization that I've come to is that there's so much, especially if you've been doing this for over a decade, there's so many things that you're processing throughout a conversation to be able to determine where this kind of goes. from step 1, step 2. And that's before you're even moved from 1 week to the next week to the next week. That's just the initial start of the whole thing.
Yep. It depends.
Yeah.
It's because I always tell people, they come in because since I do a lot in education, they ask me about my services, and I kind of give them the breakdown, and I get asked, it's like, well, you have all these classes on these things, so why would I want to purchase this one-on-one option that costs 10 times as much? And I said, hey, these classes are great. I will say that these classes I basically put together so it's going to apply to the largest amount of people I can possibly encompass in a set template, right? And a set template of me talking for 2 hours. Cool. Nothing wrong with it. But if you want to actually understand on a high level how to apply to everyone, no matter who walks through your door, and you want to be able to do it quickly and efficiently and confidently, you need to come here. Right. So, because I think that, and what I tell them is, I was like, do you understand, like, one of the biggest limiting factors on your business is the fact that you can't help somebody that comes through the door. I said, what would it be like if you, and it's not to say that you shouldn't refer people out. Don't work out of your scope. Don't, especially if you're newer, don't get in over your head on stuff. Don't have such an ego that you can't refer people out. But I'm like, what would it be like if you could, everyone that came in, or almost everyone that came in, you could accept them and you could help them? I'm like, that'd be a pretty good business model. And it might require a team. You might have to have some other people on your team to outsource, like you have the clinic, or I have other coaches on my team in my company, and we can all do a lot of the same things, but also some different things. So it's like, I wanted to build something where I could just be like, no matter who walks in the door, it's gonna be me, her, him, or him. And we've got you covered, and we have these resources, and we're able to do it. Ebook won't do that. A template won't do that. I mean, you can get pretty far. I think everyone should do that. Everyone should understand biomechanics. Everyone should understand physiology and stuff. But
I think as a coach, the process of putting those materials together is part of your educational process. So even if it doesn't sell one copy, you had to take your thoughts and put it together in some kind of rational way, which is going to make you better understand and also see where your weak points may be that need to be brought up. So it's from that side, monetization aside,
for sure,
that is worth more than what the monetization would be.
Yeah. Practice. Practice. It's like looking in a mirror. I like being challenged. It's like, I was talking to my girlfriend the other day, and we are talking about how when you're an authority figure, and like, for me, so I got all these coaches that ask me for advice, and I got the team, and I got the clients. Like, who do I report to? I report to her. Right. And I take feedback from her, and I trust that she's going to give me good feedback. And because everyone needs that, because we have gaps and we have blind spots. And so we have to have that somewhere. And sometimes writing stuff out, like you said, and even writing that process, you're like, oh, that could be better. But I wouldn't have known that until I saw it on paper. So I think that's a great point.
I got to use the restroom real quick, then we'll come back and get into some training stuff.
Okay.
Summer's here, and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com This deal is only available through the Table Talk link. I want to get into how your training philosophy has changed, which, I mean, coming from a wrestling background, I kind of know where it started. And let's stay in the hypertrophy realm. And the reason why I want to stay in that realm is when I have people that work with bodybuilders or health, functional health, whatever it is, a lot of my demographic are going to be strength athletes, and they're going to be set on however they're programming their strength phases. The hypertrophy phases is where things kind of fall apart. The other place where things fall apart is I like to classify most strength athletes as being strength athletes that live Gen Pop lifestyles.
Okay.
Right. So earlier you were speaking about, you know, some of the coaches that will get into the space, kind of staying in their lane and stuff like that, to where there's a lot of health coaches. It's a shitty word. I mean, there needs to be a better title for that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Because it's just kind of a stupid title, but that work in that space, but then they don't think that working with, you know, a strength athlete, be it strongman, you know, weightlifting or powerlifting, was kind of like in their wheelhouse. And I'm like, it's more in your wheelhouse than what you think it is. You know, let them take care of that aspect of the training, but then talk to them about sleep hygiene, nutrition, all these other things, because most of them that I've ever known, the large percentage, live a Gen Pop lifestyle, just eating more food. Right. So they're more likely they're covering their nutritional basis, but with 3,000 more calories than what they should.
Right.
Right. Which can create all these other issues. So from the hypertrophy standpoint, coming from a wrestling background, I'm going to make an assumption here that the work capacity is high, or at least your mental processing of work capacity is high. Right. So, and one of the podcasts that I listened to you on when you're in one of your preps, it was like ridiculous. It was like 2 hours of cardio a day, then a high intensity interval training session with that, plus the regular training, which screams to me, this is somebody coming from a wrestling background, you know, but it also could be the situation that you ended up in just as you dieted down for that show.
Right.
So when you work with your clients that would be intermediate or above, you know, do you work with them on the actual training aspect?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Most people, I prefer it. I like to have, you know, be able to sync all the variables together as much as possible. I mean, I have some people that outsource some of that stuff as long as I know that person. Mm-hmm. I do work with some powerlifters, actually work with, do you know the Masons? Mm-hmm. Nicole has been a client of mine for a long time. So like I have some good strength athletes that I work with, but they handle, you know, programming. Mm-hmm. Like you said, it's like, it's funny with strength athletes. It's like, man, the amount of progress they can make with better sleep hygiene and improving digestion and stuff, like
it's ridiculous,
blowing up their totals.
Yeah.
And I'm not touching anything in training. Mm-hmm. But in hypertrophy, I love that you cited my prep, because I think that's an extreme example where I've always been someone that has to beat myself to death to get in the condition, you know, to compete. And, but ironically enough, I'm very much a person that's like, get the most out of the least with the clients. Cause I always want some runway to work with. And training is no different. As we always, progression is the name of training, whether that's volume or load or intensity. It's like there has to be a stimulus to create adaptation, you know. So if we just throw someone in there at whatever their maximum recoverable volume, if you want to use those terms. And we do all those things right out of the gate and all these intensifiers. It's like we might run out of runway pretty quick. We might have to deload in 3 weeks or something. It's like that's kind of, it's a pretty short, it's going to give us a pretty short window to grow with. It would be like coming in and, you know, blast into the moon your first time out of the gates. Like, well, where do we go from there?
Yeah.
Right. Now, I think where things get very tricky is we did a couple podcasts recently, another guy from the UK that I podcast with, and we had a doctor on, you know, guy that's versed in the research and stuff. And where it gets hard from a research standpoint is the fact that everything is, well, they lack control first, and intensity varies so much from person to person. Even when you're using things like, even when you assign intensity, like RPE, dude, my RPE of 10 versus someone else's RPE of 10 is going to be different. Like you better have a stretcher ready.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But someone else, I'm like, if I just stand behind you and don't let you rack the weight, you're going to get 10 more reps.
Yeah. Anchoring it becomes a problem.
You know, so it's like, well, how do we really assess that? So I think that one of the things I have to do is understand what that level is for that person. You said intermediate to advanced. So what I'm going to kind of assume there is that they probably have at least a little bit better idea of what intensity is, I hope. So we could assume that. So I can assume that if I do assign something, that they'll be able to understand what mechanical failure looks like, right? So we'll assume that. And then next thing I'm gonna do is just assess their physique. You know, we're talking about, this isn't squat, bench, and deadlift. So it's like, you know, I have to understand what their weak points are. For some people, it's like, we just need to get bigger all over. Cool, no problem. We're going to do a pretty standard split, allocate volume pretty evenly over the week. Cool, good to go. But I'm working with a lot of people that are like national level. Most of my competitors at this point are pretty much like national NPC level or pro level, trying to be pro level. So that's kind of what my competitor demographic is. So they have probably developed, they have a good base. They've probably developed muscle, but the more you develop, the more those weak points become evident, because the stronger ones get better and the weaker ones don't get that much better. You know, so they have imbalances. They have probably injuries and things that come up because they have, you know, weak posterior chain or whatever it might be. So now I'm looking at what is the total workload of this person. So if we're looking at a basic split, now how do I take that total workload and allocate as much as I need to the weaker areas and as much as I need to the stronger areas? So
how are you defining workload? Because it's the way that I would define that: sets times reps times weight, right? So, but you may be defining it just in the total work that's being done over that week.
Right. So I use it as a broad term. So workload would be like how much volume, you know, it's like how much volume can we handle
in a working set
throughout the working sets an entire week. So like a real general term. Then we got to break that down further, because if you're strong, unracking a bar to do a barbell squat requires a lot more CNS fatigue than me sitting in even a hack squat.
Well,
machine. I mean, it's drastically different when you put stabilization.
Well, if they're stronger too, there's more warm-up sets to get there.
100%. So what I've really found over the years is, especially with these more advanced people, is I have to be a lot more, and we'll get into the workload thing. When I'm setting it up first, I have to be a lot more particular with movement selection right out of the gate. Because one is like, some of these guys, they're not powerlifters. So it doesn't matter. Like, detach from exercises. Don't care. Doesn't matter. I'm like, cool, you can deadlift 600 pounds for reps because you're huge. Awesome. But it doesn't matter. Right. So I have to kind of detach them from those movements. And I have to, a lot of the time, get people in stable braced movements. And that doesn't always have to be like doing some squeeze pec deck fly, you know, some bullshit. But it might have to be, I have to get you off of the barbell squats all the time. I have to get you in a hack squat. I have to get you in a pendulum squat. I got to get you in something where we can drive to your quads or your glutes, your hamstrings, or whatever. So I kind of have to figure out that first. What are the movement selection? Don't want to get you hurt. Make sure you're stabilized. Make sure you're driving the force to the muscle. Cool. We got that established. Next thing is I'm assessing the physique, figure out like where are the weak body parts at. Then I have to figure out, so within those weak body parts, how much CNS fatigue are we going to create? Like if your quads are weak and I have to push most of your workload towards your quads, that's going to be probably still less sets maybe than it is if your biceps. I mean, small muscle group.
Yeah.
I mean, I can do all my bicep curls to failure and I'm going to be fine the next day.
Yeah.
My arms might be sore, but if I go in and do 20 sets of quads, dude, I probably got rhabdo. You know, it's like I can't do anything for the next week. So, and unfortunately that volume.
But exercise selection could play a role there too, though, right? Because it could be that heavy thing, but then 3 days later, it's something like a leg extension,
right?
You know, or a sissy squat, you know. So the frequency, if it's trying to bring up a weak point, would you have those movements on separate days to still hit the muscle, but lower the systemic fatigue?
For sure. So I don't want to say, I don't like to lump myself into like a certain category, but I would do say I probably fall a little more on the side of frequency than I more often than not. Just because
there's caveats. So like I just mentioned though.
Right.
And I think that when that's explored, most people would fall in that same camp.
Yeah. Cause I think that, and the way I kind of think it too, is that let's say you were doing 10 working sets for your quads in a week. By the time I get to set 7 or 8, and if in a single session, my performance is just garbage. But if I can split that up into a second day, I can perform each one of those optimally to high intensity and get the progression in weight. And so I do think splitting it up that way may have merit. Now, one day might be more of our heavy movers, might be a hack squat, might be a leg press, more CNS intensive. And another day might be like some more like a cluster set, like a muscle round or, you know, something like that locked into a machine where I can just drive force to the muscle and I'm not going to beat you up too bad, but I can get all your volume in. Cool. And you can progress on either of those, right? It's been seen. It's been seen before. I mean, there's no muscle doesn't know too much what you're doing there. You know, it kind of just relates to, are we adding more stimulus to the muscle over time? And that's kind of what matters at the end of the day. So I would say in the majority of cases, I'm probably splitting it up that way where my weakest body parts are probably getting the most frequency, right? So if we have, let's say we had 40 working sets an entire week. I don't know. These are just arbitrary numbers. And I needed 50% of that to go to the weak body parts. Those might be trained over 2 to 3 days, right? Whereas if your pecs are really good, I'm probably going to give them like 4 working sets on one single day, and it's just going to maintain, and I'm not going to worry about it. Right? I'm not going to waste my work capacity on that when I know that it's not going to go anywhere. You know, so that's I mean, that's kind of the basis of the training. And then
what would be the runway from each movement? So how often will you switch that movement? So if it's a hack squat that's being put in there's optimal, then there's reality. Right. So what would be the optimal for you? And then what is normally the reality that happens?
What I find is that some people are really good at eking out progression for a really long time. But what normally happens is it's because they're making mechanical changes in their movement to do it. Like you don't know it unless you maybe see it on a video or something, but it's like maybe you're shifting your hips or you're moving around, your triceps are coming in on a press more or something. So like, they can progress for 6 months on the same movement, but it's just because they're willing themselves to do it and their form's getting is garbage.
It's a different movement at the end.
Right. So if assuming that they're locked in and the movement pattern is solid, and let's assume that's like off season calorie surplus, you know, they've got all the good stuff going on. We might be able to get anywhere from 2 to 4 months out of a movement if they're pretty sound on their sleep and everything's going well. And assuming I'm not giving them too much, we can probably get 2 to 4 months out of movement before we need to rotate something else out. And it also depends on how heavy that movement is. Like I can't progress on a bicep curl for 2 to 4 months. Like what am I going to do? I mean, I can micro load magnet plates, I guess, on my dumbbells, but like.
So with the progression, is it always weight or are you changing tempos? Because it's, in some cases with myself and other people that I'd advise, if I'm trying to get a longer runway, and it's compound movements are hard to get long runways with, especially if they know what they're doing. I may ask them to go a slower tempo, just to get a couple more weeks. And then before the end, then it's full tempo in there, where others will just increase weight. How do you try to look for the progress? There's many ways to progress,
Sure.
which I think the default for most people is it always has to be weight.
Right.
And so how do you go about that?
So it's usually going to either be tempo or even a rep range. Like we could progress in a certain rep range. Let's say we're in a 6 to 8 rep range. That'd probably be kind of a lower rep range for a bodybuilder.
Yeah.
And then we can progress in a 12 to 15 rep range. If we're doing 6 plates aside, if you're a big guy, you're strong, you're doing 6 plates aside on the hack on the 6 to 8 rep range. And we kind of top out on that. We might be able to restart in the 12 to 15 rep range, and we can, progress on that for a while.
Yeah.
I'm going to run out of runway there somewhere just because next thing we were going to be doing, I really am not a huge fan of doing like tons and tons of 25 to 35 reppers to failure within a session. I like that stuff. I think it's good for fortitude. I think it's fun.
Oh, it is.
I think it's fun.
It's also really great for systemic fatigue.
I think it's fun.
Yeah.
But how practical is it to do that like every session all the time? Probably not.
What I use things like that for most recently is if I do a clinic, I'll have people do something like that just to anchor effort.
Yeah.
Because when that's over, I can say, look, that was an effort of 10. You never need to train it at 10. But now when we talk about an 8, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And they're like, oh shit, my 4, used to be, I thought my 4 was an 8.
Right.
Like actually, no. So from stuff like that I do think it can help with that anchoring. It can definitely help with your mental health if you're pissed off about something. Right. But there's the systemic issue you're going to run into.
It's funny because and you probably don't remember this. So I actually came in with John 2012 and I trained with you guys.
Oh, okay.
And you probably don't remember. So I had shaggy hair then. I was prepping for a show then. I was probably like 6 weeks out. It was at the old place. And we did, standard 3-hour.
I think I kind of remember
3-hour leg workout. Yeah. And in hindsight, 6 weeks out, this was when my hormones were tanked before I got on HRT.
Yeah.
And you had the garage door open in the front, and we were on the monolift, and we're doing squats. We had chains or something on there. And I just remember coming up in the reps, and I swore to myself that day I wouldn't give up unless I fell down, because I got to go train with you guys. Right? And I remember just coming up in those reps, and it was just, and I was anemic too. I had no idea. Come up, and I couldn't see anything. It was just stars everywhere, speckles, couldn't see shit. Did like 3 of those. Puked in the trash can, did the whole thing. But it's like, it's okay to do that sometimes, and I think that we all have to enjoy what we're doing, and we all have to test ourselves, but doing that all the time. Yeah.
See, John loved that shit. But the secret behind all that people don't know is that was pretty much like a 2.5 year to 3 year process of increasing the work capacity to that point.
Right.
To where he just loved the fact that if anybody came in and trained, they would just die.
Right.
Right. And for us, and that's where work capacity can become a really strange thing to discuss, right? Because it wasn't necessary to have that work capacity that was developed at that time. From a strength athlete standpoint, no, but it's definitely possible, to develop it if it's physically, because there were waves where it would kind of like come up and then, structure up all through there. It wasn't just, we're just going to do 40 sets of quads or whatever it's going to be. But from that bodybuilding perspective, and even from a strength athlete perspective, at what point does it really even help anymore?
Right.
Especially for bodybuilding, because you don't need strength endurance because you're going to pull a deadlift 4 hours or 5 hours after your heavy squat.
Right.
Like, where does that come in? It's fun, right? There's no doubt about that. But, and for him, that was, John liked the volume, but not all the time.
Right.
Right. Which is funny because he'll be characterized as, the high volumes like the Meadow stuff, and then the low volume would be like Dante. And it's like, which isn't
totally true.
Not true.
Right.
Like there was other phases that came in there. But if we're speaking about, I guess this would be challenge sets, like, would you integrate those in with your clients to be able to, from a psychological perspective, to be able to help anchor that in effort a little bit more?
For sure. And I think one of the things I've found is that sequence in which I add them into the sessions has changed a lot over the years. So for myself personally, and for those people that train on that level of intensity, I've had to kind of restructure. Like if I do stuff like that, it's in the end of the workout anymore. Like, cause I can't, I'm done. It's over. I'm toast. I can't even do anything else. And my effort might be there, but the load that I can use is going to be pretty dismal after that. But I do think it's great just from a realization standpoint of like figuring out where your limits are. And it's something that as a bodybuilder, I think that you should enjoy what you're doing too. So I like to integrate that stuff into most people's sessions, especially if we have the calorie resources and their sleep's good and we have the recovery resources to do it. I mean, I maybe won't do that 2 weeks out from a show.
Yeah.
Like that's completely unnecessary. And I'd be pissed if somebody got hurt.
Yeah.
Sure. I'd feel like a real,
well, the inflammation that you can accumulate can be an issue too.
Right. But as long as we have the recovery capacity to do it, for sure. And I mean, I do it with myself, and you know what? Would it be better if I did it less often? Maybe, but I don't care.
Well, that kind of gets into what you're talking about with, the RPE and the RIR, because if we use a movement, and the leg press is probably the best example of that, is, there would be people that would come out, to train with us, like yourself or, other ones, and we're doing a leg press, and, you're doing, John, like you're doing like 8 work sets, right? Some stupid amount of work sets. And it's like 8 to 10, 8 to 10, 8 to 10, 8 to 10. You can look at them. They're all like 2 RIR, maybe 1 RIR. Then on the last one, you get on their shit, you get them going, and then there's 25. So every time I would do something like that, or I'd see somebody else do something like that, I discount, like, was I even working on the other 7? And that's where that becomes that conversation of that effort or RPE is, in what mental state are we attributing that we're allowed to be in, right? Because if I'm just in a normal mental state, the 8 to 10 is probably a rep too shy of failure. This psycho mental state, it's different. And so is the systemic fatigue. So is the adrenaline release. So is, everything that follows. You can fuck up the whole week, after that, because of that whole thing.
It's I like that you said that. I've noticed that, like, when I train, I used to, on the way to the gym. So I train at home now because I have a, home gym outside my barn and stuff. And I used to be like metal or the wrap and shit all the way there. And I'm like, dude, I can't do this anymore. I said, I'm blowing my whole wad before I even get here, So I have to reserve that a little bit more for certain sets, but like you said, finding that balance between going into that space, like how often can I operate in that space? Some people don't have that, but if you can tap into that space, you'll realize it gives you a whole new perspective on gauging the intensity on the rest of your, sets.
Well, putting it last is smart too, because it can destroy the whole rest of your training, especially if you don't know how to pivot, because if the squats are first and you're doing all that, but then you have a leg press or something second, you may have to change that movement.
Right. Yeah. It's different if you're powerlifting and then you're doing accessory work after. Totally different ball game. But as a bodybuilder, if you're looking at hypertrophy and you're looking at progressively overloading throughout a session, and your goal is to try to do that from a week to week basis or session to session basis, you do have to sequence things in a way that allow you to do that from session to session.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, when you're kind of laying out these blocks per se, you're moving the repetitions up over time, not pulling them down.
Up or down. So we may start higher and then stall in that rep range and maybe move to a lower rep range, or we may go the other direction. Some of it depends on movement too. Like, again, a bicep curl, I can basically operate in any rep range, and I'm not too overly concerned about the systemic fatigue from that. A hack squat or a leg press or an RDL or something like that, it's gonna be a little different.
Well, if we're on the biceps, for example, would you have the frequency being 3 or 4 times a week because of that, and then just one movement?
So, like, I can use myself an example. Right now, I'm doing what I would kind of consider, because I kind of do all mine in like a prioritization phase where I'm going to take what I know as my workload capacity, and I'm going to allocate a lot to the weaker body parts that need to come up, and everything else is basically trained to maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, quads and hamstrings are basically just maintenance. I train them 1 day a week. I probably have 5 to 6 work sets on my quads. I probably have 5 to 6 work sets on my hamstrings. I've been doing that for months. They make small amounts of progress, but I'm not really trying to grow those things as much as everything else. Back, which you could say like, rhomboids, teres,
Mm-hmm.
erectors, traps, and lats. So there's a lot there.
There's a lot.
There's a lot to that. That would be one. And then bis and tris. That's kind of where I'm at. Delts are at maintenance. Pecs are at maintenance, more or less. I train calves every time I go in because they suck, and they'll probably suck forever, but whatever.
It won't be because of lack of effort.
Yeah, I do what I can. But for biceps, for example, I train them 3 days a week. I mean, I don't have any issue with that. They get sore a little bit, but it's not like I can't do it. And they're probably about 4 to 6 sets a session, per session. I spread that. So it's about 14 to 18 sets in a week total.
Mm-hmm.
And I spread that out over 3 days. Works great for me. I do various movements in terms of, supinated, neutral grip, pronated, whatever. Long head, short head. I don't know how fancy you want to get there. We do all that, short, lengthened, shortened, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I have no issue with that in my biceps. I could probably even do a little bit more volume. Frankly, it's just, I get to the point where they're so pumped and so blown out that I can't even get a full contraction on them anymore. So it's like, that's kind of my limit on that. But would that impede my performance on anything else in a session? Probably not too much. It probably wouldn't create so much systemic fatigue that it's going to like cut into my back.
Well, if you're doing it right, it shouldn't. Now, if you're doing, a cheap barbell curl with 315 for reps,
if I'm doing
shit, then it would. But
yeah, for sure. And again, it's sequence too. It's like I'm probably going to train the bigger, more demanding muscle group first in that case, because my biceps don't take. I'll say this, I don't always want to do them because I'm tired from hitting back, but I can will myself through that and no problem. I could get through it and perform well and still progress. But on back, I might not. Same reason I train my calves first, because dude, I don't want to do that shit at the end.
Yeah.
I do them at the beginning of every session because I don't feel like doing it at the end. I'm going to walk out. But sequence, I think sequence for me has been huge in figuring that out for other people. And stronger people, the stronger you get, the more important that becomes with exercise selection and sequence, just because of the fatigue it takes to set up a movement. It's again, like I use the RDL as an example. Doing an RDL when you're doing 6 plates aside for 10 reps, I mean, there's a lot of fatigue that comes into getting set up for that movement and getting in the right position and handling it. And that's a lot different than me getting in a glute ham raise or something else where I can just lock in and focus and grind reps. So those things become more and more and more important. Like you said, warm-ups, 6 plates aside requires 5 warm-up sets. Yeah. It's like, I mean, shit, those warm-ups, you're doing 4 plates on a warm-up. I mean, that still requires quite a bit of systemic fatigue, and your nervous system does adapt, but your nervous system never adapts the way that your muscular system does over time. Because if that were the case, if we got huge, we would just still be able to do 50 sets in a workout if our nervous system forever got, forever adapted, but it just doesn't work like that.
So if you're progressing through and you're going to change out a movement, say it is the RDL, and then that swaps out to a glute ham raise. There's that glute ham raise may require 1 warm-up set, then you're into your work sets. But when we're talking about total work, the total work of the glute ham raise may be 20% of what the total work was for the RDLs. So are you accounting for that with either more sets or perhaps 2 different movements? Or are you using that as just being part of that natural phase, almost like a deload?
If I'm just switching movements just for the sake of continuing progression, I'm either going to need to add sets or add a movement. If we're doing it as a deload, that's a whole separate thing. But I'm going to account for like how much ROI am I getting off of this movement in comparison to the other movement? Because it's definitely going to be a lot different. So I might have to do 3 work sets instead of 1, or do 5 work sets instead of 3, or I might have to add a lying leg curl or something in there with it, or maybe I'll add an intensifier on the end of it. Whereas I may not do an intensifier on the RDL, like 1 straight set to complete mechanical failure, just going nuts, versus, glute ham raise, I might do something where I'm doing it weighted and then I drop the weight, or I do someone assisted, some assisted negatives if I have a partner or whatever. I can add those intensifiers in there to make up for that extra, workload that I'm missing. Right.
So where would you fall on the science with even doing the intensifiers at all?
I'll tell you that I've done less and less intensifiers over the years. The more, and I'm not like an Olympia level bodybuilder or anything, but as I've gotten more developed, I've been able to handle less and less intensifiers because, one, I can do my straight sets better. I can also create more tension on rep to rep. I think that's kind of an underlooked thing, is like, you ever notice, and I'm sure you have, it's like, you notice an advanced person how like rep 1, you're locked in and it looks just as taxing as rep 10. Granted, the speed's maybe a little bit more, but like, there's no shifting in form. Everything's perfect. Tension's perfect. And it's just, a beginner doesn't do that. They're like, I don't even feel anything until I hit rep 10. It's a whole different ball game. So as I've gotten stronger and more and better at creating tension, I've had to kind of scale back on some of that stuff. I'll still do intensifiers on things like, I might do like a lengthen partial or something, like in a stretch position on something, but I'm probably going to avoid anything that's going to put me in a lot of danger. Right. So when I say that, is I'm probably going to stray away from doing intensifiers on something that requires a lot of stabilization. Right. Just because, knowing myself, I'm going to go till I probably can't see anymore. And then I'm like, don't know where I'm at and what's going on. And then I think it's just maybe puts me in a higher risk of injury. Whereas in a machine, I can get away with it, but again, stronger, bigger, stronger. I have to kind of scale some of that stuff back because of the CNS fatigue it comes with.
So then how will this all change as you're leading to a show?
So first thing I would do coming into a show is realizing that, like, the amount of volume it takes to maintain muscles is like substantially less than it does to create it. I think that the first thing to realize is, like, the first half of your prep, if you can't maintain a similar work capacity than you did in the off season, you're probably doing something wrong. Or if you're doing way more, you probably were half-assing your off season. I kind of laugh at that. They're like doing twice as much. I said, because you're dicking around the whole time, But if we're talking, when we're getting to the leaner stages, a few things happen. One, you lose leverage. When you when you're losing a lot of body fat, you lose leverage. You don't really have the cushion anymore in the joints. You can't come out of the hole on stuff. Your belly's smaller. You can't get if you're wearing a belt, you don't get the same bracing. My elbow sleeves aren't as tight, all that stuff. So I'm simply going to lose leverage, for one. The second thing is, I'm going to be under more systemic fatigue, just because I'm probably doing like more cardiovascular activity as well. So that's another thing that's eating into my recovery. I have less calories. My sleep might be starting to get a little funky in there as well. So that's even more strain on my CNS. So first thing I'm going to do is start pulling out the stuff that doesn't give me much ROI. So that would be like fluff, anything that's in there that's like accessory work, or anything that's maybe not going to give me as much stimulus as the big movements. That might go first. I want to try to maintain as much strength as I can. That's going to keep the tissue on me. So I might start pulling all that other stuff out. Next thing I'm probably going to do is cut the volume back a little bit if I have to. If I don't have to, or feeling good, cool, keep rolling. But if we have to, we might, shave a work set off. If we're doing like a top set and a back off set, maybe I'm going to take the back off set off, right? And we're just going to stick to the top set. I can still maintain that load. So we're start kind of picking things out, pulling things off, and eventually we're stripped down to a kind of probably a similar amount of exercises, but at a lot lower amount of volume by the time we get to the end. And then also, by the time you're 2 weeks out from a show, I mean, the muscle isn't going anywhere at that point. You kind of have to go by feel on that. If you're really beaten to the ground and you've had to really dig to get in shape, you kind of have to just listen to your body at that point, because you had mentioned systemic fatigue. It's like, it's the same reason that people back off their training going into the week of the show. It's like you're clearing inflammation. You're going to be more separated. You're going to look better. You have to take that into consideration too, as I don't want to be just a look inflamed, going into the contest. So I'm not having just because my guy can squat 500 pounds for 10 reps, like, we don't need to do that shit 4 days out. Like, I don't think it's a wise thing to do.
So then with that contest prep, have you found longer preps are better than shorter preps, or there's really no difference at all, assuming that you're starting in a good place?
I probably err a little more towards the side of long, just because shit happens, like there's obstacles that happen. You have a bad week. I don't know, power goes out at your house, your food goes bad, like anything can happen. You have to go on a work trip. Even if we know that you need to lose 25 pounds roughly in a prep, and we kind of program it to lose 1.5 pounds a week, like, that's best case scenario that you don't have to take a day off. Right. I mean, what's the chances that you're not going to accumulate fatigue and not have to take a rest day somewhere in there? So I think that it's just from a having some cushion standpoint, I would program in a little bit more. Now, I can't sit and say like that's 20 weeks or that's 18 weeks or 24 weeks, because a lot of that depends on how fat you are and how much, and how much, like, how quickly you can use body fat. Are you enhanced? Are you not enhanced? Like, what does that look like? But I much prefer to be able to have, in an ideal world, everyone's ready a week or so early and we can just coast, we can coast in the show and we don't have to do anything. I mean, that would be ideal, but what normally ends up happening is you plan for that, some shit happens, and you end up ready right on time. And then, you go into the show. Now, there are downsides to the longer, though, because I do think when we're talking adaptation, we're looking at downregulation and things like thyroid conversion and leptin levels and systemic fatigue. There still is an argument that longer exposure to that stuff, even if it's slower, could be a problem. So I don't really prescribe to the idea of prepping for 8 months just for the sake of only losing a 1/4 pound a week. I think eventually too long becomes mentally taxing and becomes probably creating more adaptation than you really want. So there's got to be some kind of middle ground in there.
Well, if it's too long, wouldn't the calories become too low?
Well,
towards the end,
the idea of longer would be that you have less, more subtle calorie restrictions and more subtle adjustments over time. But there eventually becomes a point where that time, that length of exposure to that deficit is problematic. And of course you can like refeed in there, and you can take, some people, they do the super long preps and they'll do like full week diet breaks, where you're like out of a deficit for full weeks and things. And that's a viable option. And a lot of people prescribe to that, but I probably fall somewhere in the middle. I don't know that there's a lot of people that are going to be peeled in 12 weeks. Like, it doesn't, like, there's hardly anyone like that. Like, those are the people that don't end up in shape on show day, and people always underestimate how much fat they need to lose and how much weight they need to lose, especially newer people. Bigger guys always lose more weight generally going into shows. Like the guy I prepped for Chicago, it's like he was lean at 305 pounds.
Wow.
He's 5'10". He's like separated quads and abs at 305. He still ended up at 255 on stage because the first 20s fluid and shit in his colon, It's like someone that big, there's so much space in there for fluid and water and adipose tissue that they're going to lose so much more weight than my 130-pound bikini girl that ends up 110 on stage.
Yes.
But their length of prep might be similar.
Yes. I've seen a lot of that with powerlifters that will retire or want to do a bodybuilding show or diet for a show, whatever it's going to be. And they walk around maybe like 285 and they think, right, they're going to be like 245. And I think Justin Harris told me one time Ronnie Coleman won his first Olympia weighing like 244.
Right.
You know, so then these guys really don't realize until they start dieting down that most likely they're going to end up at like at 215.
Right.
You know, but while they're walking around at 285, 290, they think they're going to be shredded at 250.
Right.
And it's just not how this works.
It's like the first 10 pounds is visceral fat and they don't even see it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
You're like, man, I've lost 10 pounds. I don't look any different.
Well, I've joked too that, you know, because I went through this as well, that there's a fugly phase too.
Flat and fat.
Yeah. And that's where
face.
you're like, what the hell? You know, I looked better when I was fat and big.
Yeah.
You know, this is terrible.
Yeah.
And then mentally kind of getting through all that. But with the competitors you're working with, they've done this multiple times. So they kind of know all that. So this would be for them, and even for yourself, is every time you get in the single digit, like the first time you get in the single digits, it's kind of like a mental nightmare, right? And each time you come back down, is it better?
I don't think it's better in terms of like you all of a sudden feel better there, but I think you make less mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's pattern recognition in terms of, a great example would be like refeeding or giving some days off. The more I prep people, the more I can catch those things before they become a big problem. And I know that if I let you go 2 more days, we're going to have a ton of fatigue and we're going to need an extended break. Whereas I'm already kind of seeing it creeping in, and let's just get ahead of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So because the idea would be as you get better at those patterns that you aren't wasting any days in there. Right. There's no really wasted days where you're sitting stagnant or you're sitting heavily fatigued. I can catch those things early, which might require some extra check-ins on my end, you know, might require some extra monitoring on my end, especially as you get further into it. But you just make less mistakes. You understand the person's body better. You understand where their fatigue threshold is a little bit better. So you can get through the prep smoother with less wasted, you know, with like less wasted days in there. You do 2-3 days here, 2-3 days here. You've just shaved off a week, 2 weeks. Now you're ready early, or now you're leaner than the previous prep. So it probably doesn't get easier, because I mean, I think I've done, I don't know, probably 13, 14 shows in total. And I always end up, super low calories and tons of cardio every time. But I get tighter, you know, I get tighter. I look better. I look bigger. I can fill out better. And all that's just a product of recognizing things earlier. So I'm making less mistakes in that process.
So how do you manage and work with others? So it's, again, it'd be a personal, and then working with others too, on keeping your neat, right? You know, so your basic metabolic rate. So how many calories you're burning per day, you know, from off season to preseason to you start, you know, pre-contest, cardio goes up, all this other stuff goes up, but you also start laying on the couch way more, watching TV way more. So the majority of your calories, if I'm not mistaken, is not burnt during the actual movement. It's burnt to your NEAT levels, right? So how do you keep that in check? Because that's a weird balance, right? Because that can fall the longer the diet's going to go, and that can fall at a greater rate than the cardio that you're trying to put in. Yeah. So you just put in more cardio, which is burning less calories than if you didn't let the frickin' NEAT fall.
Right. And there's different, you know, some people prescribe to like the step, mm-hmm. you know, doing steps. And I think it's an okay method. I think it holds you a little more accountable as far as that looks at like a total daily expenditure. But even steps aren't perfect, because if you weigh 250 at the beginning of prep and you weigh 210 at the end, you're moving less through space. Each step you take burns less calories. Yeah. And you become like, your resting heart rate goes down as you become more cardio adapted. So your movement becomes more efficient. You're burning less calories for 20 minutes on the treadmill at the end of prep than you did at the beginning. Right. So like, none of those models are perfect, right? Mm-hmm. Because in any of those cases, not only are you wanting to move less, and there's little things like you You used to take out the trash every day and do the dishes every day, and now you don't because you're tired.
Mm-hmm.
You used to tap your foot at the desk and do other things, and you stop doing those little things, and then it adds up. You take that and you add in the fact that everything you do is now burning less than what it was when you were heavier. It's like put an obese person on the treadmill, and in 10 minutes, they're like, it looks like Niagara Falls over there, because they're so poorly adapted to cardio that the amount of calories they burn versus a little cardio bunny over here who's been doing an hour of cardio every day, it's substantially different. So there's not a perfect model, but if we're doing a step model, and I do both with people, I kind of go based on people's preference and also maybe what makes sense for their schedule and their kind of mental space. Steps can work good for people, but sometimes it creates like a super obsessive behavior. You know what I mean? And I'm like,
I know what you mean.
So I'm like, okay, so for some people that might not be, I just don't want to add any more reason for them to be neurotic.
Mm-hmm.
So like, that's not a good model for you.
Mm-hmm.
So we might use the traditional walk this much on the treadmill or whatever. And I can make that a little bit more standardized by like giving a heart rate, perhaps, because your resting heart rate is going to go down. So if I'm like, hey, all of your walking sessions need to be 100 to 120 beats per minute, they're going to have to pick up their intensity the later in the prep to maintain that heart rate goal, which kind of tells me that we're probably burning close to the same calories, throughout that. So that's another way to standardize it. And if I am using a time model, as generic as this sounds, I'll be like, I want you to try to live your life as normal as you can. If you used to do these chores at home, keep doing them at home. If you used to contribute these things to your family or to your whatever, keep doing them. If you used to like to do these activities, I'm like, just think of prep as it's the same as every other day. You're just eating a different amount of food and you're doing a different amount of stuff. So like you talk about laying around on the couch and resting. If I'm assigning that to you because it's a rest day and I need you to chill, that's the one thing. But otherwise, I want you to try to participate and do these things, because most of the stuff, that's all low intensity. Them taking out the trash and them walking through the house and sweeping the floor and mopping is not, it's not going to create a lot of fatigue, but I can have them continue to do keep as much normalcy in their life as they can. And that will help maintain those NEAT levels, to the best of my ability. But I would say the step model is probably slightly more standardized. It's just that some people don't do well with it from a mental aspect. I've had people, I'll tell you this, I've had people get completely peeled on walking on the treadmill fasted every morning. I've had people get completely peeled on doing literally no time cardio at all and just tracking it all on their watch. I think you have to be able to replicate it, and you have to be able to track it consistently and maintain NEAT levels the best you can. If you can do that, any of the models work. Yeah.
Well, I think that, one of the things that you said about the treadmill kind of brought back a story to me, to where I'll circle this back around with what the takeaway is during one of the times I was dieting down, there was a lot of cardio that was in there, and whatever 110, 120, whatever the heart rate was I was trying to achieve, it inclined at like 8% grade, 30 minutes. It became very, really hard for me to get that to happen. And it was one of the appointments I had with Serrano. So I'm like, I don't understand like what the fuck is going on. Like I've always been able to do this, and then this was the outcome. But now I can't get the damn thing to go up any higher than I can barely even get to where I was, from the heart rate perspective. And this is, anytime I dieted down, I never wanted to be show ready. So whoever I worked with is like, look, the goal here is like 5 weeks out for the world you guys live in. I know what happens after that. I've said, I'm not naive to this whole shit like that. I don't want to do that. And so his reply was, so what you're telling me is you got in shape, because you get better to that. But the way my brain was working at that time, because you're in a deficit, you're training, everything's regimented. You're kind of like a monk, right? And my brain would only operate for like 30 minutes after a meal anyhow, where if you don't have a coach kind of helping you with this kind of stuff, it's really easy to discount the obvious. Like yeah, maybe I needed to just go higher incline or faster,
Right.
to be able to do that. But you're not thinking that because you're fucking in autopilot mode. Like, here's this, here's a meal, here's this, here, I got to work here. Everything's just locked in the whole thing. So I can see where it's really easy to just, I got a 2-hour break. I'm just sleeping.
Yeah.
The NEAT falls and all these other things are going to fall, which would be obvious to that same person 4 months prior.
Right.
But once and it's not that the brain is actually becoming dumb, which it probably kind of is, but everything else has become so high priority that the obvious things get missed. And where a coach can help with that, or if they can't afford a coach, somebody else that just does the same thing that's not in the same prep period that can look at that and be able to say, oh, you know what that is? Because as soon as I was told, I felt like a freaking idiot. Like, oh yeah, okay, I get that. But I'll see the same thing if it's, a powerlifting coach and they're used to working with top lifters all the time. And the last thing that they're really looking at is, are they grabbing the bar even?
Right.
Or if they're squatting, is it on their back even? There was months after a shoulder surgery at Westside. I will say that, you couldn't stand behind anybody the way the gym was set up. Where the monolift was, it faced out.
Wall,
so there was a wall. And it took a coach coming in probably 6 months post-surgery, so I might have taken off. Well, it's me. I may have taken off like 3 weeks, and then had somebody shove my arm in there and asked me, like, why are you carrying the bar 2 inches off to the side? I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm not doing that. Like, yes, you are.
Right.
And there's no cameras or phones. I'm like, somebody look and it's like, now this is 20 other guys I'm training with, you know what I'm saying, for 5 months, and nobody realized that the bar was offset by 4 inches.
Right.
Where that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the bracing, we're looking at the head position, we're looking at all these other finer things, and the basic shit just gets lost.
Sure.
Where I can see that same thing kind of happening as, an intermediate or even pro bodybuilders going into their prep, where all the focus is on that weak point, where's the water, where's your cortisol, where's your stress, overflowing. That's not what I'm spilling over. Meanwhile, the basic shit, like NEAT.
Yep.
Isn't even being looked at because it's just assumed that it's being taken care of.
Yep.
Right. And I think when you're dealing with, and I'd like your perspective on this, when you're dealing with top athletes, that's usually where the biggest issues come.
Yeah, because they get hyper focused on these details, right? So it's like that hierarchy of needs. It's like they just kind of assume that because they're high level that all those other things are going to be taken care of. It's a very odd software in the brain, and in prep, it's easy to do. It's one of the things I encourage people to do is I'm like, don't think of it like it's not anything different, right? I said, especially those people that are really good in their off seasons that are executing year round 100%. I said, yeah, it might be less free meals, you're not to eat less, whatever. But it's largely, you need to be focusing on the same stuff: sleep, movement, blah, 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 blah. I said, I'm only changing numbers, I'm pushing and pulling, working stuff. But your tendency is to get hyper focused on those other small details. But meanwhile, you're missing out, like you said, you're missing out on the important stuff. And and again, we were talking earlier about abundance of information, and that's making it harder and harder on me as a coach and on people that are coaching people, because I'm like, you need to get off Instagram for a bit, please. We got to stop having too many cooks in the kitchen here, and stop, worrying about all this stuff. And because that's why we pay somebody. It's like, I have an accountant that does my taxes, and I just basically tell him what I need to tell him, and I trust that he's the professional.
Well, I think that if you're being locked into something, because when I was still competing, one of the things that I always did is, if I was training for a meet, which is basically all the time. So the whole time I was at Westside, I never subscribed to Powerlifting USA. I wouldn't read powerlifting forums, because here's how I'm training. Here's what the bias is. Here's what we're doing. I don't want anything to impede that because I'm trying to maximize the efficiency of what's actually being done. So if I start looking in all these other places, I'm going to start questioning things. So the easiest way to not question things is don't look in other places.
Yep.
Now, after a meet's over and it's, it's not as important, then you look around, then you kind of do it that way. When I would try to pull body fat off, it was John or Justin or Shelby or whoever it was, I quit reading anything that had to do with all that because of the same reason. And it was just a habit that I, have always had. But I think it would serve a lot of people really well, to be able to do that because your commitment to the thing that you're doing goes up, right? And when that goes up, that means other commitments in your life are probably going to go down. Right. So the way that you can avoid those other commitments in your life going down is remove something, which is usually what you think is education or entertainment. Remove those things completely out of the mix, and then you'll have more time for those other commitments that are in there. Because during that short time period, 3 or 4 months in a span of a lifetime is not a long time. It's not necessary. And it's counterproductive.
Right.
Because if you keep that all in there, then where are you going to find the time for these other things, let alone a hobby? That's why when you mention a hobby, like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, who has time for hobbies? Hell, as a business owner, people ask me that all the time. Like, what are your hobbies? I'm like, man, I'm working on it. When did you start working on it? 20 some years ago.
Right.
I'd love to be able to put it in there, but when? And I know it's an excuse.
Yeah.
It's me just falling into my own trap, catching myself again, thinking right now I need to come up with a hobby, knowing damn well I won't, because but if you have those outside people, if they're involved with the industry, even better, but at the same time, you should have those outside people that aren't involved in the industry.
Yep.
Because that perspective is one you don't want to hear. Right. But when we're talking about these sports and the commitment to these sports past the beginner level, the definition of health and wellness shifts a little bit, right? Because these are not healthy things,
right?
When you peel it all back. So when you work as like a health specialist, that's better than health coach, but I'll come up with something, hopefully before we're done, I'll come up with something better than that. There are still things that you have to keep in check. So what would be some things that if they're going through a prep to where this prep is over? Because that's the last thing anybody's ever going to want to hear or do. But for the betterment of their health, there is going to be a tipping point, which you want to avoid at all cost. But as we've seen over the last decade, some people have died, but I think more from diuretics, and I have my theories on all that. I'll ask you, I'll just throw that out here before we get into this. I was theorizing during that time period, because that was also when everything was kind of being locked down, that you have somebody prepping for something, then that gets moved, 6 weeks later, then they just continue the prep, then that gets moved again, 8 weeks later, and now they're continuing the prep. And in my brain, I'm thinking, okay, thyroid cleanse, I'm thinking all the things that are helping to burn that fat, which isn't exactly the best for your heart over a longer duration. And because a lot of those, it was at a rapid pace for a couple of years.
Right.
It seemed to die down, which makes me think I'm Alex Jones and my conspiracy was correct.
Right.
Right. So, but getting back to the original question of that health and wellness, at what point or what indicators because you're going to catch them before, it's got to be really, really bad to cancel a prep.
Sure.
Right. A good coach should be able to catch that before that even happens.
Sure.
So what are some of those things that you're looking for?
Yeah. So like acute issues versus chronic issues, because understanding that even if you start the prep in the perfect position, which is the ideal, like that's another thing is when you talk about issues in prep, something that would halt you is a lot of people are going into prep with 1 foot out the door already, and that's why most of the people that I prep, I don't like taking people just for prep.
Yes.
Like hey, I got a show in 16 weeks. Can we start tomorrow? I'm like, dude, I don't know anything about you. I mean, I can get some blood work and stuff on you. I can look, but I don't really know. One, it's difficult because I don't know anything about your body. And two, it's like, I don't know anything about your health and what other things might come up. So having someone in the good position from a digestive aspect, from a stress standpoint, from a life standpoint, and nothing's ever perfect. If you're an entrepreneur and you have businesses and you're crazy busy, like there's no perfect time to do anything. You just kind of have to do it, you know, but we don't have to put ourselves at a disadvantage when there's stuff we can make better. So like that's first priority, because that in and of itself prevents a lot of issues later. But then once we get into the prep, understanding like what amount of negative adaptation is normal and what amount is going to be problematic. So things like thyroid downregulation, well, you probably are just going to take exogenous thyroid in there. You know, things like seeing your lipid panel skewed and your HDL go down because you're using PEDs. Like, well, we know that.
Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link.
That's going to happen, right? But we also know that it's going to go back up pretty quickly when we come back out. But we start going in, we seeing like your EGFR is like a 30 or something. Now we're talking renal function. Now we're talking some scary shit, some stuff that's potentially, it's not liver enzymes anymore. These are things that are potentially problematic. I'm seeing like massive edema on somebody. I'm seeing, people that are completely unresponsive or swelling or having major weight fluctuations. Like these are stress and inflammatory things that are potentially chronically problematic that would maybe indicate to me that we need to step back. But most negative adaptations we see in a prep are completely normal part of that process. I think the more important thing is understanding and working with someone that knows how to fix them when you're done, and not just and hopefully you stay on with that coach after the prep and that you have a successful post-show period. Yeah, you're going to eat some shit. You're going to do the whole thing, but having someone there that can actually help you navigate that stuff post-show is going to be super important, and not just coming out of the show and doing your thing and just switching compounds and continuing to just roll for the next 6 months, until something breaks.
Well, would that time period be when you're looking for what their baseline is? Because everybody's going to be a little bit different, on their baseline. So if it's post-show and they're not blasting tons of shit, all this other kind of stuff, you should be able to see, a relative baseline.
You mean as far as like labs?
Just labs and stuff like that.
Yeah. So hopefully I have a baseline prior.
Okay.
Right. I have a baseline prior, and then I do like drawing. I do like to have a kind of an idea of what do the worst labs look like? I want to see the worst shit. Like, I know it's going to look bad or worse.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say bad. I should say it's not going to look as good as it does when you're not doing anything.
And nobody wants to do the labs during that time.
It's like, I would like to know what that looks like. And so I have an idea of good, bad, where's the middle. I think that, what's happening to people over time is that we know the good and we know the bad, but the good's getting a little bit worse each time. Our good's not as good anymore. We're recovering less and less. The ones that kind of get me are, like I mentioned, renal function. There have been some individuals that have, had renal failure and things like that. It's like, you go in and you see real basic marker like your EGFR, which can be skewed by your muscle mass. So take that into consideration. But you don't walk in one day and have a GFR of 20. That takes a lot of time. So one of two things happen. You ignored it. You saw it, but you ignored it, or you never looked at it. Right. It's like there are certain things that adjust acutely, like your lipids. Your HDL is going to go up and down pretty quick. You come off stuff and it's going to shoot back up to probably wherever it was within as soon as shit clears out. Right. LDL, same thing. Liver enzymes affected by training. We know that that's kind of a crappy marker for people that train and have muscles. So it's like, we know that stuff's going to move around, inflammatory markers even. But when you start looking at things like renal function markers, or you start going in and if you want to go a step further, you're getting like a calcium score done. If you're really advanced and you're getting a little bit older, you're getting a echo done. Like those are things that, independent of whatever you're doing, would show you like a long-term outlook of where you're trending. Right. And is every person going to go in and get an echocardiogram done? Absolutely not. I mean, what's the percentage of people in bodybuilding, powerlifting that have had an echo done?
Not a lot, right?
Some,
but I can do that with my Apple Watch if I wanted to.
Right. Well, or a calcium score to look at, arterial plaque. Like it's not as common, but these are things I want, markers that would indicate chronic dysfunction over time versus like, and that's important for the coach to understand that too. Because if a doctor's perfect example, you go into the doctor and you train the day before and your AST and ALT are, 120, they're like, oh shit, go to the hospital. We got liver failure. And I've seen that happen. I had a client that happened too, and they went in, doctor freaked out, and they tried to rush him to the hospital, and they emailed me, and I'm like, what's going on? And, found nothing, of course. I was like, hey, we'll get them retested. Give me a couple days, take a couple days off, and they're 100% normal. Like stuff like that. We know that they're acute changes, but certain things take a long time. That's why I'd cited the renal thing. It's like, that doesn't happen overnight. Those are things that take long periods of time to regress. You're not going to do one cycle and end up with stage 5 kidney failure. Doesn't happen. You're having high blood pressure for years on end and carrying tons of body weight and doing all those other things. And that's when that stuff starts happening. And for my bigger guys, I gotta pay closer attention. I also have to understand that perfect or good is like a little bit lower for them. And that's just the reality of it. It's like good enough. Like I got to make it as good as I can, considering the circumstances.
Well, if it falls under good enough, health issues aside, would that still not make it harder for them to get in the condition they need to be in?
Yeah, it absolutely would. And I think that's where it's, as I've gotten to work with bigger people over time and more advanced people, I've noticed, you see in pro bodybuilding, for example, like the pinnacle is open men's bodybuilding, biggest guys, right? Some of them, they just don't diet hard enough. They don't get into, they're afraid to lose muscle, whatever. They don't get into shape. Sure, that happens. But sometimes there's a look about some of the guys where it's like, you can see it in their skin and their face and in the tone of their skin and the color. And they're very lean, but they never get hard. They never get the separation. They don't get the detail. They always have that like film look about them. They're like, oh, they should have just took, they needed a diuretic. They need to cut their water. And I'm like, but maybe this is a chronic inflammation issue and they're as lean as the other guy, but it doesn't present the same way. So those things would happen. It would be harder to get into condition. It would be harder to peak for the show. It would be harder to attain that look that you want. And then you get those guys that have done the right stuff and they look kind of fresh. It's like, okay, so there's a difference. We can see a big difference in the skin and the, in the facial appearance and their eyes and all the stuff. And it looks different. And they're able to get into shape easier. They're able to peak better. They're able to get those fine details. So that stuff it's not like you can't get there, but it's not going to look as good and it's going to be way harder to accomplish. Right. And then what's the effects of that repetitively and how often are you doing it? It's a big reason that these guys trying to qualify for the Olympia for example, like they took out, from my understanding, they took the point system out. So now you have to win a show. It's like, I feel bad for some of these dudes because they're having to do, they're just trying, man. They're doing 5-6 shows in a row. And by show 3, they're a shell, they can't peak anymore. They don't have the same.
Were they kind of still doing that if they're trying to accumulate the points though?
They were, but some of them could point in, some of them could point in a little bit quicker than they could actually having to win the show. Cause the idea of winning a show as a pro bodybuilder is difficult. Like how many, it's like 0.1%, that are actually going to win a show and be on the Olympia level. And so these guys are just getting ran into the ground. And all they're doing is increasing their oral dose in between competitions to try to mitigate the fact that their body's not responding anymore. It's like, man, there's got to be a middle ground where the better you function, the better you respond. And so we have to find that, and still, like, while we're pushing the envelope, we still have to find that enough better, that idea that we're still functioning good enough to continue to respond and do these things over and over again. And that might mean not doing the next show. That might mean a longer break between the shows. It might mean titrating your dosages like less aggressively into the show. More is better until it's not. We know that more training, more androgens, like more of everything creates a dose response until eventually it doesn't anymore. But I think a lot of people just more is better until more is better forever. Right. But we know that's not true. Like there's a limit to that where you're kind of an inverted U, and eventually the side effects outweigh the pros. Yeah. And we try to avoid that.
What are some of the things that are trending right now? Because these are interesting fields that on social media, because, things come, in these waves. And from the dietary standpoint or the bodybuilding standpoint, what are some of the things right now that are hot topics that, because every year there's new hot topics that kind of emerge where, gut health, which you kind of specialize in. A few years ago, like everything was attributed to gut health. It didn't matter what it was.
Right.
Everything was. Is there anything like that now that's kind of going around?
Man, there's always something. And we could break it down. So since I'm kind of in that functional health and the bodybuilding space, and functional health, everyone wants, just like in bodybuilding, it's no different. Everyone wants the thing that's wrong. So we were on gut for a while. Now it's like everyone has mold or everyone has like parasites or something, it's like we latch on to something for a little while and then it goes away, because some high profile influencers will push this stuff out. And then eventually we realize that it could be any of these number of things and each person's different. We always come back to that every time because that's the answer. Yeah. And within bodybuilding, there's a couple things. One is this, a big push, which is, it's cool to see, but I think it's also a little bit deceiving, is like this idea of the safer use model is like a thing now. They coined this term of like using less to achieve a better look and stay healthier. It's like, well, that's kind of a good goal regardless, but I think it's deceiving because most people aren't complying to it.
Well, it's amazing to me that, TRT use is now 2 grams, where, it's because the narrative around this has increased, which is good and bad. I think it's a net positive, and there's always going to be negatives that are associated with that, but it's a net positive if the person that's considering actually explores more voices instead of just finding one and just listening to that one. Because I think that's what leads to teenagers taking Tren in high school, where if they just expanded and listened to more voices, they would find pretty much nobody is advocating.
It's not as common as they think.
Yeah, well, yes. And anybody that knows anything about this is not advocating for teenagers to take fucking steroids.
Right.
Nobody.
Right.
But they'll find that one voice, that will resonate, and that's what they do. And, but with a lot of these things, that's kind of how it moves. Right. Instead of listening to more voices, they just narrow down into that one,
the loud one,
that loud one. And because of that, now anybody who would be taking blasting gear, it's now TRT. Right. Where the actual TRT dose is going to be dependent upon what keeps you at that 800 or 700 or whatever level you want to be at. You know, for some people, it might be 50 milligrams. I mean, it's not going to be a whole lot for some people. Other people, it might be in upwards of 400, but it's certainly not 2 grams.
Right.
Where that's been the fun thing for me to watch is nobody now blasts gear. It's just all TRT.
Right.
It's like, okay, you know, who's transparent about what they're actually taking? You know, not a whole lot of people.
Yes. And that's one area that's become big. I think the other areas, nutrition's been a little quiet. Training's been the one recently that's been really, there's been a lot of back and forth about that just because of, again, the research coming out, but the research is ridiculous. I mean, some of these studies are showing like 50 sets is better than 20 sets. I'm like, who in God's name is doing 50 sets of squats in a workout? Like who are the people? For one, they don't know how to read. And I'm not saying I'm not saying I'm an ultra expert on dissecting research to it, but I understand it enough. And the controls are garbage. The participants are garbage. You don't know anything about what they're doing outside of that. And of course, if I do 50 sets, my quads are going to be 2 inches bigger because they're going to be so damn inflamed for next week. Like, let's measure them. Sweet.
Well, nothing happens in isolation either.
Right.
You know, so it's interesting because the original research on eccentrics was strong. Right. But that was really all that anybody was really speaking about. Now it's a stretch position.
Yep.
Right. So it's like, I'm just following the path of a repetition. Right. So in another year or two, the concentric is going to be,
we'll circle back.
You know what I'm saying? That's going to be, you know, and it's just kind of how it all works to where it's fun to watch. And there's probably something to be learned from all that. But again, it doesn't all happen in isolation. There's a lot of things where the effective rep one is one that is interesting, you know, to look at, and I can comprehend it. I understand what they're talking about, but if, you know, 2 reps shy of failure or whatever it's going to be, so then why are power lifters that do 3s and 5s and not more jacked? Right. So there's a lot of questions, you know, that kind of fall into there. And then the reps that lead up to those effective reps are building work capacity, you know, so for bodybuilding, maybe powerlifting, you know, maybe a little bit more degree, not as important, but to a wrestler or something like that, work capacity is a big fucking deal.
Right.
Right. So effective rep or not effective rep, it's not the most important thing to being that better athlete, you know. So it's a lot of these things get spoken about in isolation.
Yep.
You know, instead of, and I guess that's okay as long as the person who's digesting the information understands this is one thing in isolation, you know, versus, and nutrition's kind of the same thing, but it has gotten a little quiet. Just give it another year. You know, something else will pop up there. But because they'll take a micronutrient, you know, in a diet, and whoever has a diet that just composes of the one micronutrient.
Yeah, because a lot of them are based on like correlation equals causation, right? Yeah. There's like and I find that interesting because looking at lab work, you know, looking at hormones and things like that, it's like this causes this. I said, okay, maybe for a second, but the fact of the matter is the rest of that feedback loop is going to also respond to that, and something else is going to happen within that, because we're designed. It's pretty cool how we're designed. We're basically designed to protect ourselves no matter what happens, you know. Like there is always a counter mechanism that's going to do something else to protect us. And so as long as we're not in any one of those states for too long, our body's pretty good at just balancing stuff out, right? Like our whole goal is to basically like be the same body weight. Don't be super lean. Don't be super fat, you know, don't be don't be super strong, don't be super weak. Like we're not really designed to do any of those things, which is why bodybuilding, powerlifting are so cool, because we're having to create adaptation somewhere. But our body, and that's why like the stress thing's so important, is I can't tell you how many cases that they're very complex. Like I pull blood work and we do like a stool analysis and we see all these things. And sometimes it's really bad. Like it looks rough, but there's been plenty of cases where with minimal intervention in terms of supplements or medication, they get better. It takes a while, but they get better because we provide the environment, which is the lower stress environment. We're getting adequate sleep. We have good sleep hygiene. I can understand how much training they can handle, how much they can't, and we do some basic supplementation. And over time, their body does exactly what it's designed to do and they get better. Now, not every case is that easy, but it happens. It happens a lot of the time. And because a lot of the time, the changes that we're seeing are just, all they are is adaptation. All they are is a protection mechanism, where our body's not dumb. It's trying to keep us safe.
Yeah.
It knows what it's doing. It's just that one of those pathways starts like inflammation. Like we need inflammation. Inflammation responds to muscle damage. Inflammation responds to gut microbiome or injuries, or cut your hand or your thumb or drop the weight on your foot. Like we have to have those things, but too much becomes a chronic issue. Immune system becomes disrupted. Now we have a problem. So it's just like, how do we give ourselves an environment to where those things calm down, and we do that long enough and our body will do exactly what it's supposed to do, and we are back to baseline. The trick is that, and I mentioned this earlier, that in a general population person is a lot different than that in a bodybuilder or a powerlifter, because we are doing so many other things that are disrupting homeostasis at the same time. So my goal in a functional health case in a general population person is to create a result and sustain that result forever. Here's the lifestyle. Here's what you can handle. Here's what you can do. Here's the nutrients you need. You can pretty much maintain this model with maybe some subtle tweaks as you get older. You can do it forever. Lifestyle, right? Lifestyle, or we call them a lifestyle client. But in a bodybuilder, it's like, here's what we have to do in a prep to maintain it. Here's what we have to do in off season to maintain it. Here's the differences between those things. And so it's like we fix it to break it again. We're fixing it because we know we're going to break it again, but we want to try to break it less and less each time. And so it's working with those cases is different. And I enjoy it because a lot of the people that work in that functional health space don't work with bodybuilders. So I'm like one of the few that actually has brought it together. And there's not a lot of people that are working with like big, huge bodybuilder guys that are doing this stuff. And it's just really cool to see, because these dudes have good genetics. You know what I mean? It's really cool to see what their bodies can actually do when you do some of these interventions. And it's like, man, what kind of potential we were missing with some of these guys. Like your gear works better, metabolizes better, your food works better. I've got guys that are eating, 1,000, 2,000 calories less in the off season because they're absorbing food so much better, and they're just blowing up. And it's incredible to see, but unfortunately it's not really come into the limelight enough yet, but we're getting there.
With the functional side or the functional health side, bodybuilding, all that aside, so those practitioners, are they embracing resistance training more now than they have in the past?
Yeah, I think most do. I think that, and I can't speak for everyone, but I know most of the people that I work with, if they're coaches that practice that type of stuff, they probably were competitors or are competitors, or they live that lifestyle. So they're kind of naturally inclined to suggest that stuff anyhow. But I do think it's definitely become a lot more prevalent. But I'm also not naive to think that there's plenty of, I find it interesting. Like there's plenty of people that don't do traditional weight training that look good, quote unquote, that are healthy. Like you could probably accomplish shit doing Pilates and doing some hard resistance yoga and some body weight exercises. But weight training expedites that process. I mean, I think the difference is you just get a lot more bang for your buck with weight training than you do with those other things. but I'm not naive to think that you can't look good and accomplish a lot of those things without it.
No, but I think from that side, the resistance training's come a long way over the last decade.
For sure.
Where, it wasn't even a thing because it's like what meatheads do or stereotype.
Yeah.
And now it's way different than what it was and should get more popular.
For sure.
Just because of the health benefits associated with that. It gets weird when you're the retired powerlifter or retired bodybuilder trying to wrap your head around doing this for health.
Yeah.
When the whole time it wasn't really about that, so that's a different psychological conversation, to be able to work through that.
The one that I feel a lot of people struggle with is the coaches that I work with that have a heavy competitive background or they're actively competing and they're working with those other people. They have a heavy bias towards what they did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think not necessarily, we're not talking about necessarily suggesting weight training or anything, but I think they have a hard time when it comes to like goal setting and stuff for people. They have a hard time wrapping their head around not wanting to be like that.
Well, that and mindset as well.
Yeah. You're like, dude, I have, and I'm, through and through, I'm a bodybuilder. And even when I'm not competing anymore, I mean, that's just who I will be forever. But I'm fully aware that I don't think anyone's weak or dumb because they don't want to they don't want to lift weights 5 or 6 times a week and do that stuff. I think you can still accomplish and be, look good and be healthy without doing that. And I also understand that not everyone wants to weigh their shit every day and, and do all that stuff. And I think that a lot of people are closed-minded and think that they're just weak or this and that. It's like, dude, there's a lot of life out there.
Well, I think they forget they had to develop those habits themselves.
Right.
So at some point in time, they were not weighing everything. They were not as regimented when they first started.
Right.
And they forget those first several years.
Right.
Right. And it's easy to forget that because if you've done it for 30 years, 3 years out of 30 years is pretty fucking easy to forget. And you're going to think that you were always that person that was always doing that. And that's simply not the case. And you're dealing with people that are in those first 3 years, but don't have the same desire that said coach had when they first got in.
Yeah.
They're in for health or whatever it's going to be, which is a different drive, a way harder drive to be able to work with people on than when there's a tangible competitive goal. It's like, we just want you to be healthier. Well, what the fuck does that mean?
Right. How do I keep doing that? Like, what am I striving for? There's no tangible timelines or anything. And and that's why we always talk about having to meet people where they're at. It's like for some people coming in, if they are just used to eating McDonald's 3 times a day, the idea of tracking macros to the T and weighing everything to the gram and drinking a gallon of water every day and taking 40 pills a day, like, dude, I'll take 60 pills a day. I don't care. They're just pills. But for some people, I mean, that's a lot to wrap their head around. But this is what I always tell people is like, your goals are your goals. I'm going to try to push you towards something that's probably best for you based on what I see. But I also am not going to push you towards what I think you have to be if that's not what you want to be. But understand that each goal requires a different tier of effort. If you've been eating McDonald's 3 times a day and now you're eating protein, a lean protein in each meal and taking some basic supplements and we get some labs done, you're going to get to this level. But if you want to go to the next level, just understand that it's going to require this next level of effort. And if you don't want to, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like, it's not my business one way or the other. I'm just here to kind of direct you towards what I think is going to help you long term. But a lot of the people that coach those people but have competitive backgrounds have a really difficult time with that. They just can't wrap their head around the fact that someone wouldn't want to optimize what they're doing. And I'm like, dude, it's not that big of a deal. Like, it's not that big of a deal. They can do whatever they want. I mean, I'm not going to recommend anyone do anything deleterious if they're general population, but I'm also not I'm also not going to be like, you have to be the biggest, strongest version of yourself. Like if you want to just be better than average, good, because you're still,
Mm-hmm.
you're still ahead of 80% of our fattest country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know, good for you, man.
Mm-hmm.
I give you props. I think that's difficult. And I think living, and I know there will come a day where I'm not competing anymore. And I've had to, and I think that day will probably come sooner rather than later. And I'm having to visualize what that's going to be and just let go of some things and understand I don't need to be 250 pounds or 240 pounds. Like, I don't, but it'll be hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I think working with a lot of other people has helped me realize that it's okay and that there is a different life that you can live after. And so that's why I do continue to work with that crowd. That's why I continue to surround myself with different demographics and get exposed. I think the more situations you can be exposed to, the better off you'll be.
Yeah. Were there any topics you wanted to go over I didn't bring up?
I know we talked about the stool testing a little bit, if you wanted to, because we were talking about GI. So just so people know, because we kind of grazed over it slightly, but if you are interested in that type of stuff, there are some, because we talked about how blood work could give you some indication of some of those issues. There are some more specialized testing that we can use and that I do use often, and that a lot of the practitioners I work with will use. And that's, so generally there's a couple different versions. The one we often use is called a GI map. So it's a Diagnostic Solutions is the name of the company. Basically, you collect a stool sample at home, poop in a little tray, collect your shit, you know, get it,
box it up, send it out.
Send it off to the lab. So now this is different than what you would do at a gastro doc, because they're generally going to be testing for like infectious pathogens, E. coli. They might test you for H. pylori, some stuff that's going to cause acute infection and make you sick.
Some may only test for blood.
Or that, the blood in the stools, things like that. What we're looking at is it will test for those infectious pathogens, but it also gives you a much broader scope of immune markers that come out in the stool, microbiome, so commensal good and bad bacteria, parasites can show up on there, yeast and fungal infections can show up on there. They don't always, but they can show up on there. Other digestive markers like fat in the stools, pancreatic enzyme function, H. pylori can show up on there. Infectious pathogens can show up on there. So you're getting a lot broader scope. And so we can take that and we can create a plan to go ahead and in a really simplistic sense, you're kind of killing the bad stuff and supporting and repopulating the good stuff. I mean, there's obviously a lot more to it. Yeah. But that's kind of what most of those would entail to some extent, is balancing out that microbiome. So there are other options than just going to your doctor and getting put on a proton pump inhibitor and to not have acid reflux for the rest of your life, you know? Yeah. So there is a lot more in-depth stuff that you can do out there provides a long-term solution.
Staying on that topic, how would somebody go about, because do they need to convince their doctor to actually have that done, or do they just reach out to the company to do it?
So the nice thing about it is it's very much like ordering private lab work. You can actually buy the kits on your own. Okay. So it's nice. So you can, luckily in the US, we have a lot of testing we have access to. It's been tricky because I've been doing a lot more consults with people in different countries where it's a lot harder to get, but I've found that company's pretty good. We've been able to get them in Europe pretty easily, Australia, Canada. I was even able to get one in Poland the other day. Didn't speak very good English, but we got it done. But they could reach out to someone like myself or any qualified practitioner, and we can either, so we do one of two things. We either go through like a private website to order it. You know, you got just like you would order labs, same thing, send the kit to your house, you do it, you send it out, then I would evaluate it. We would work from there. And that's something I do for my ongoing clients, but I also do like a lot of one-off consultations with those. I say one-off, but some of them are, I tell people, caveat, as I do recommend follow-up for a lot of those, because it's hard to just give you something and send you on your way and expect it to be like one and done. But yeah, I mean, I bet you I probably look at between my own clients and all the other coaches I help, dude, I probably look like 50 of those things a week.
Well, yeah, I'll put this
dude,
out
it's
there.
So much.
Yeah, I'll put this out there just for people who are thinking about this. Is I've had it done several times, and I still remember the first time because you get the kit and like, I don't want to do that. It's not as bad as you think it is.
Yeah.
It's nothing even close to that. You know, it sits right in the toilet. You sit down, you shit like you would normally shit, and then you screw the top on the thing and you send it out. It's not what I thought. I'm like, man, this is going to smell up the whole bathroom. I'm going to gag when I go to put the thing back on. It's nothing like that.
Yeah.
You know, where after the first time, breeze, you know, not a big deal. Now, had to get a colonoscopy because of one of those, but that's a whole different, and that wasn't even that bad either. So
yeah,
is what it is. But that's what they found blood, right? Hemorrhoid, you know, so
yeah,
you know, so that's an interesting time period because they find that and it's like, oh, now you need to go do this. You're like, oh God, I'm going to die, you know, and it is what it is.
And sometimes, and I would say 95% of the time, it's just all stuff we can fix. And I will say every once in a great while, I do catch something on there where I'm like, I need to get you in with a specialist and get some imaging done just to rule that out, especially when you're getting into people that have a lot of inflammatory bowel disease, because then we're getting into risk of, you know, cancerous cells and stuff forming. And so I will refer people out, but I will say I find that stuff very seldom where it's to the point where I'm alarmed.
Yeah. Well, even in that case, though, the earlier, the better.
Yeah.
Where who knows how long that would have been until they would have actually had anything done.
Yeah.
Right. Years. I mean, it could have.
So if you're
became way worse,
you know, and no, digestion is dynamic. I mean, you can, like, we could go and do a 2-hour leg workout and I could have diarrhea for 2 hours because we pushed too hard, you know, like it can happen. But if you're someone that's having, you know, that's like pissing out your ass every day and you're, you know, and you never have a formed stool or you don't go to the bathroom for 3 days or you're chronically having acid reflux or something, like, reach out to somebody. You know, there are solutions to that stuff, and it can make a huge difference. And not only the way you feel, obviously you feel a lot better, less brain fog. I mean, systemic inflammation, less joint pain, better cognitive function, better skin, but also just there's risk of other, you know, that systemic inflammation is a high risk factor of other potential autoimmune conditions and maybe even, heaven forbid, like really serious stuff like disease and cancer and stuff over time. Now, granted, I'm not trying to scare anyone.
Yeah.
Because that's generally not the case, but it can increase risk of some of those things.
Well, just from the meathead perspective, you know, if there's too much inflammation, your progress you're going to make in the gym is going to be less.
Right.
Fact.
For sure.
Mean, nobody's going to disagree with that. And taking Advil is not an answer, by the way.
No.
You know, well, people confuse that anti-inflammatory, and it's not the same thing.
Right.
How can people go about finding you?
So I'm pretty easy to find. You can get me social media. So on Instagram, I'm Austin ST and the number 8. In my bio, there's a link tree. So that would have like email to contact me, any inquiries, consult, coaching, mentorship, just shoot me an email. There's also link to, like, I have a YouTube channel I put a lot of videos on. There's link to my Facebook on there I put info on. There's a link to my classes is on there. So that's all in a store. So you don't actually have to talk to me. You can just go in and buy them and download them.
Yeah.
So, like, basically, as long as you go there and go in the bio, you can find everything.
Well, I know that you've been around a long time because I believe your email is still an AOL account.
OG email.
So I wouldn't change that because that puts in the that shows that you've been doing this for a long period of time.
Yeah.
You know,
never going to change.
Yeah.
Some people have given me shit about it. And I was like, do you realize the authority that the AOL email gives me?
Any final thoughts?
Man, appreciate you having me. Yeah. I haven't been to the new gym yet. So I was glad, I was glad to invite. I wish we would have had our other guests.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. I felt bad. Paul's struggling, but I gave him some well wishes the other day. So his wife, Olivia, actually, I helped her turn pro in Toronto. So she was a client. She just got her IFBB pro card. She won the overall at the Toronto Pro-Am in wellness category. So plug. plug to her.
Yeah.
So they're friends. They accommodated me, gave me a hotel room, all that stuff. So that was my first time in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Never, I don't know why I would ever want to go to Canada, but nothing really. I just keep an eye on my social media. I give free content all the time. Any classes I have, like anything, I pretty much keep everything updated. I post like every day.
All right. Well, thank you for coming out. It was great seeing you again, and we're done.
Cool.
All right, guys. Thanks for watching the video to the end. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and click here, 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 or here for more videos.